Yes. All righty.
Okay, did anyone see Mind Your Own Business at the last Libertarian meeting? There you go. Well, it was basically a documentary, and I got the opportunity to meet this documentary maker, and one of his projects, upcoming projects, was global warming. And I already had the presentation created for global warming, so I figured let's toss it into a documentary. He was going to get to this on number 4 or 5 on his list. I figured we might be able to help move him up on the schedule if we just made a prototype for him, sent it to him to see what he thought. So we will be turning this into a documentary. If anyone wants to help me, I'm glad to have some help. Go ahead and watch the presentation and think about, if you would be interested in helping make a documentary. Let's see if we get this thing rolling. It takes a couple seconds to fire. Yeah. It's a big documentary. Or a big PowerPoint. Did anyone just come from that meeting over in, what was that?
Cotman Hall.
Cotman Hall. What do you think of that? Well, we're going to address a lot of those points that he addressed. But the difference of what he did and what we're going to do is everything I'm going to talk about today, you can get right here on the disc. This disc will have everything that you're going to see today. Every bit of research that I refer to will be on this. You just click on it, and it'll take you to it so you can do the research. I found it very fascinating because he was pretty accurate. We just came from a presentation where the guy addressed skeptics, environmental skeptics. That's pretty much what I am. And he did a pretty good, accurate job of saying what they're going to address or what people like myself address. And we're going to take a look at it and see, let you decide, is the skeptic is this worth being skeptical about? I'm not going to tell you what to think. I'm just going to simply show you the data. And when I'm showing you this data, I want you to think in terms of, does it make sense? Does it fit the scientific process? And most importantly, does the chart or the data that they have support the conclusion that they reach? How many people have seen Inconvenient Truth? Did anyone see Lori David here a couple weeks ago? Rats. You did?
Yeah.
Okay, can you remember that guy that asked the question about the chart?
Yeah.
Okay, what was her reaction?
God, I don't know. It was kind of a mix of just kind of general, like, taken abackness and I don't know.
From your impression, why don't you give the audience a little description of what happened and what was the conclusion that she reached?
I just stepped in for a little bit. I honestly wasn't there for the whole presentation.
Well, I was the person who asked the question because their whole theory is based upon CO2 increasing, causing temperature to increase, right? So if you're going to have that as your theory, you better well have a chart that shows CO2 going higher and temperature going higher, right? And if your CO2 is making all-time highs by record levels, you would expect your temperature to be at least near an all-time high, right? That's logical, simple science, right? If one causes the other and one's making an all-time high by 33%, you better expect that your temperature is near an all-time high. Well, I pointed out to her that the chart in her movie doesn't even show that. Al Gore gets on this, it's a scene with the crane where Al Gore gets on it, goes up 12, 13 feet, and he points out that the CO2 is record high. Well, I pointed out in the question that if you look at the chart, temperatures are actually going down. And her reaction was basically shock. She got real defensive and she totally avoided the question. And you'll see a little bit later on why she avoided the question, because the entire foundation of her theory doesn't really hold water. But I'll let you decide.
If it doesn't the thingy thing, you can just click it.
Okay, click next. Okay. First of all, why would I be giving this to a libertarian group? Right? John Stossel is probably one of the most famous libertarians, and he spends a lot of time with global warming. Why would a libertarian kind of focus in on this subject? First of all, environmental policies often rob you of your freedoms and your liberty. They typically will use environmental policies to pass laws to basically control people or impact social change. Spotted owl is a good example, blocking anwar drilling, a whole bunch of different things. DDT is a good one we'll get to. But typically, The environmentalists will use the government as a mechanism to force their beliefs upon society. And they often rob people of their life, liberty, and as you'll see, even life. Libertarians typically want smaller, more effective, and honest government. So if we're going to make policy changes based upon global warming science, we would want to make sure that this is an honest science, that it actually holds water, that it actually reaches the conclusion that the data points to. And last, of course, is the documentary. If anyone wants to help me make the documentary, I'd be glad to get some help. You'll see the PowerPoint can probably use some tune-up and video editing. I can use a little bit of help there. Next one. This is global warming. Once again, with this presentation, I encourage everyone to take the discs, make as many copies as you want, give them to all your professors that they want, discuss the science with your professors. I've got nothing to hide. What I'm doing is I'm using their data to make arguments against them. All right? And I'll have a dialogue with them. I won't be sitting there just giving you a one-way monologue. This is what the Union of Concerned Scientists point out. Man causes CO2 to increase. CO2 increases, traps solar energy, causes the globe to increase in temperature. Does anyone disagree with that? That's the whole theory, right? If now, speak up. Forever hold your peace. Okay, let's go on. This was recently given by John Hart here at Ohio State. These are his charts. CO2, world energy consumption, right? Now, I mean, when I'm looking at this, this looks pretty doggone convincing. You're burning petroleum, CO2 goes up. That looks pretty logical to me, right? That's a pretty doggone good case. A lot of correlation right there. This goes up, this goes up. Next. Okay. This is similar to the chart Al Gore shows where he gets on that crane, goes way up here. This level of CO2 is higher than any time before in history, right? This goes back 150,000 years, and CO2 is at 370 parts per million, right? A full 33% higher than ever before in history. Well, it happened this century. It has to be due to man. His title was Global Warming, Why the Skeptics Are Wrong. We're going to let you decide. Next. Okay? Temperatures. Here's a temperature graph. And look here at the end. This is what's called the hockey stick chart. This comes from the IPCC report, the National Panel of Climate Change. Okay? This is probably one of the most famous global warming charts out there. Once again, that temperature, it draws a line right here, 1998. That temperature is higher than anywhere else on this chart. Right? Next. First half of 2006, warmest on record in the U.S. Next. Undeniable global warming. There is a scientific consensus. Right? Nobody disagrees with this. Next. So what are the facts? Facts are CO2 is a global warming gas. Does anyone disagree with that? Man produces CO2. CO2 causes global warming. And man-made or anthropogenic CO2 is the main cause of global warming. Has anyone ever been told otherwise? Right? That's the whole theory. Al Gore made a movie on it. Well, let's go take a look and see how they made this movie and what's the whole basis of this. Right? Let's take a look at the next one. Well, let's step back for a second. You are fortunate to have not lived through the 70s, or at least probably remember it. I did. And back when I was a kid, I was scared to death not of global warming, but of a coming ice age. The same people that are telling you today that you're going through global warming, they told me I was going to be experiencing an ice age. This just happens to be out this week. This is a Newsweek article. They're going back and saying, remember global cooling? Here's a report called Global Cooling. That's what I experienced when I was a kid. Once again, with this CD, you go home, you can click on this, you can go open up the actual report. I was told we got 10-year supply of oil left, you got global cooling on the way, you got a coming ice age, you had a population bomb. All these just extreme fears were put into us. They were 180 degrees off, if they're right today. Just within 30 years, they've gone from one end of the spectrum to the other, and now they're expecting you to believe the other end. Next. Once again, I went through the population bomb. Jimmy Carter was telling us that we had 10-year supply of oil. I was thinking we're going to be living in igloos with nothing to heat the house. It was just fear-mongering beyond belief. But that's what I experienced. And then as we know what happened after the 70s, we had an oil glut in the 80s, the 90s. We're just now starting to have the price of oil go back higher. Okay? They're dead wrong. 100% off. Next. More ironic is today, they sit there and they tell you about the melting ice cap. Right? That's a big fear right now. Well, back when I was a kid, they proposed melting the ice cap to prevent global cooling. They had a solution proposed such as melting the Arctic ice cap by covering it with black soot. So back then the environmentalists were saying the way we're going to save the world is by melting the ice cap. Today they're all hysterical every time you see an iceberg break off of the Arctic. Okay. Next. This is another one. This comes out of the National Geographic. What I found interesting about this one was back then they said global cooling caused all these hurricanes, extreme weather climate changes, storms, floods. Back then they were saying global cooling was causing it. Today, you get the same thing, but it's global warming causing it. So which is it? Bottom line is they just happen. Okay? But back then, when the argument was global cooling, they said that this global cooling was going to cause all these dramatic changes. There's also a nice little quote, experts agree they cannot yet predict climate change with any assurance, and I'd make the argument they still can't. Next. Okay. Who remembers the ozone hole? You're probably young, old enough to remember the ozone hole. Right? Why haven't you heard about it recently? The reason you haven't heard about it recently is because they banned it back when I was a kid. They banned all the CFCs. Since 1995, the concentration of CFCs has been going down. But this is just in the headlines this week. Ozone hole hitting a record high. So I grew up thinking these CFCs are killing everybody. I thought if we stopped out, we put all these people out of business that made CFCs, stopped all these refrigerants from being produced, we're going to save the world, stop the ozone hole from growing. Well, they stopped the CFCs all right, but the ozone hole just kept growing. And that's during a period when the CFC concentrations were decreasing. So if you make that argument, what you should be doing is increasing the CFCs to start shrinking it, because clearly by decreasing the CFCs, the ozone hole is increased. Once again, you can click on this, and it'll take you right to the link, so don't take my word for it. This is the research that's out there. More importantly, I had this thing down here. You know, back when I said the libertarians are concerned about liberty, freedom, how it costs lives. Just last year, we had 35,000 people die from heat stroke over in Europe. I'd make an argument, a large number of those people probably didn't have air conditioners, and they probably didn't have air conditioners because you don't have because when they banned CFCs, refrigerants became much more expensive. Okay? So instead of having cheap air conditioning over there, you have a bunch of dead people. Next. Okay. Who remembers DDT? Okay, DDT was a big fear also. Once again, just this week, the WHO is recommending using DDT indoors. Okay, this is such a dangerous product; they're recommending that it be used indoors. More importantly, this is from Al Gore's movie. You get The Inconvenient Truth. This is his book. Al Gore is saying that with global warming, malaria is even becoming worse. So he's saying global warming is causing malaria, but he certainly didn't say anything about how do you stop malaria. If you want to stop it, you stop it with DDT. Sorry about that.
Maybe your little thingy is actually starting to work. There we go.
All right. How about
Hit escape.
Oh,
Okay, you got it.
okay. Okay, well, once again, in Al Gore's movie, he makes the big thing here that global warming will actually cause more malaria. Well, WHO came out to the rescue this time saying, well, Forget about a lot of stuff you're told about DDT. It's safe anyway. Just go ahead and use it. Okay? This little guy down here is chasing his tail. Okay? It goes into another idea of the libertarians. We don't want the government wasting a lot of money. So once again, we wasted not only a bunch of money, but over 10 million people die a year from malaria that could have been prevented from using DDT. Okay? Those are 10 million lives lost. Okay, before we go on, I want you to think about the data. I'm sure most of you have had science, you have a science background. Think about if you are going to use a drug that's gone through the FDA approval process, think about the science processes that you'd want them to follow. Think about the type of data you would want them to collect. And think about how you would want them to use and run their experiments. And think about, when I cover some of these things, ask yourself if they would have done, if a drug company would have done that, would you have trusted that drug? Okay? First of all, you'd want them to use a consistent data source, right? If I'm going to go out there and use, measure weight, I want to make sure the same person, the test was done on the same scale, using the same type of the scale. You can measure weight a lot of different ways, but I wouldn't want to see some people being measured by, taking their waist multiplied by their height. Some people, put it in a bath of water, see what the displacement is. You'd want to see them just basically using a scale, which is a direct measurement of weight, for as much of the data as they can. Okay, direct over proxy, you want to see them measuring things directly. You can measure the age of a person through their teeth. You can also just look at their birth certificate or ask them. More than likely, if you're going to do it, a study on age, you want to make sure that they're looking at their birth certificates or simply asking people. Okay? Multiple confirming measurements. You don't want to just take one measurement here, one measurement there. You want to have different measurement sources, all confirming your conclusion. And comprehensive. If you're going to come out there and you're going to say the person has a rash over 90% of the body, you'd want them to take a look at 100% of the body to make sure that it's a valid comment. Well, let's go back and take a look at all this. Here are the charts. Temperature. This comes from the IPCC report, by the way, International Panel on Climate Change. This isn't my chart. This is the chart that's being used to make policy. This backs the Kyoto Treaty. Carbon dioxide. That came from one of the preeminent global warming scientists who gave a lecture right over here at Ohio State. Before I go on any further, does anyone disagree with those charts? That's what we're told. This is what the scientists are using. So if you disagree with it, we'll have a problem. But pretty much that's what you got. Let's take a look at this data. Okay? First of all, let's take a look at carbon dioxide. What's the most prominent or most important greenhouse gas out there? What is it?
Carbon dioxide.
Does anybody disagree with that? Besides you. CO2 is the most potent greenhouse gas out there, right?
No.
What is?
Methane.
Methane is not. Water vapor is, believe it or not. Methane is actually right here. It has a higher potential, but it contributes a lot less. Okay? The most important greenhouse gas out there is water vapor. You're never told that, but it is. Right? Now, why wouldn't they tell you that water vapor is the most important greenhouse gas? Because they can't make an argument that man causes it, because nature causes all the water vapor. So when you put all the greenhouse gases together, okay, CO2 is negligible. Zip. All right? Water vapor constitutes Earth's most significant. Now the CO2 is way off the charts. But once again, if you look at the temperature, this is a peak in temperature. This is a peak in temperature. This is a peak in temperature. They're all way above the current peak. And the current level is below even the most recent peak. Temperature is going down while the CO2 is hitting record highs. This is their chart, not mine. This is the one Al Gore uses. This is the one I asked the question to Lori Davis about that she ran from. They don't want to address this question. Okay? Once again, statistics, basic science 101. If CO2 is 25% higher than any time before in history, according to Al Gore, and we saw the last data that's not true, Okay, why isn't the temperature anywhere near an all-time high? That's what I would think. One causes the other, right? Cause and effect. That chart didn't prove it to me. Okay? Well, let's take a look at this. This is called the hockey stick chart. You want to have some fun? Search Google hockey stick chart. Okay? This is the cornerstone of global warming. You got to show that temperatures are higher than ever before. Okay? And this is it. If anyone want to disagree with that chart, it's showing temperatures going through the roof. Right? Deja vu. How did they create a temperature graph going back that far? Remember, the thermometer was invented in 1714. First of all, Northern Hemisphere. All of this data comes from the Northern Hemisphere. They call it global warming, but show me any data from the Southern Hemisphere. Show me any of these charts that even mention the Southern Hemisphere. Okay? First of all, once again, Northern Hemisphere. The thermometer was invented in 1714. All the way up to, where is it? 1980. They were using tree rings, coral, ice core, and historical records. Now, can anyone explain to me why, when you have a thermometer record, you're using ice core, corals, tree rings to determine what the temperature was? I can tell you why. Because when you do that, it has a pretty low average. And when you have the thermometer reading, it's higher. So when you remove this data, the average shoots up. Well, that's what they did. The temperature readings, the data from thermometer goes from 1902 to 1998. Okay? So we have thermometer data, which could go back to 1714, but they only use 1902 to 1998. But the coral rings and stuff go from 1000 to 1980. So between 1902 and 1980, there's a mix match of these data sources. The reason they're doing that is because when you include all those temperature proxies or estimates, you pull down the average. When you yank them away and you no longer use the coral and the tree rings to measure temperature, the temperature shoots up because you're getting a direct measurement. If you're just going to use thermometers, which I can't prove, but we do get to one with a longer-term track record, you're going to have it flat. You're going to have normal temperatures. Okay? But once again, this is from the IPCC. This is their chart, and that's the science that they're using. That's going to determine the Kyoto Treaty. Okay? Arctic cooling, global warming. The reason you don't ever hear about the southern hemisphere is because it's cooling. They don't tell you that. This is from real climate science from climate scientists. Okay, these are the preeminent climate scientists out there. They started their own website to argue against people like me, so I'm using their own words to fight against them. Arctic cooling, global warming. Their data shows that the Arctic is actually cooling. Southern hemisphere is cooling. So there's no global warming, there's a northern hemisphere warming according to that funny data. But we're going to get to that too. Okay? Southern hemisphere ignores global warming. This was just out recently. You can click on that. Here's the southern hemisphere. It's actually cooling. Okay? And once again, don't take my word for any of this. Take one of these CDs. Everything is linked to the data. Okay? One interesting thing, if you want to have some fun, if you want to get into actually do a little science project yourself, is go out there and find the longest continual direct measurement. And where you find that is the Albany, New York weather station. And you can download the data. And you can do your own research. You can go and download the data set going back to the early 1800s. Well, what you'll find is back in 1822, the average temperature was 49.2. And you find the most recent version, 2005, it is 49.2. That doesn't tell you anything, really. It tells you 2 points in time, the temperature was the average. What you do when you do this kind of research, you take the entire data set, you're going to run a regression on it. Well, when you do it, you find out that your regression slope is negative. Temperatures have actually fallen on average since 1822 if you use the same consistent methodology using direct measurements of temperatures over the long run. Don't take my word for it, go do your own research. Okay? Also, they keep talking about the ice cap melting. It's actually thickening. Okay? You confused yet? Okay. I'm going to get you a lot more confused. All right, now remember I said what you want to do is, let's say you're testing something. It makes a good idea to maybe measure a few different ways, right? If you're taking your temperature, you might want to use a mercury thermometer, the electronic thermometer, and maybe just use some IR. Okay? There's multiple ways to measure something, and typically if you measure it multiple ways and 2 or 3 of them confirm and one doesn't, what one would you do? If I measured something 3 different ways and 2 of them confirmed and one didn't, what would you do? You'd probably ignore the one that wasn't confirmed by the other 2, right? You say, all the other testing proves this, but this one's kind of an outlier. Would you put all your weight on the one that's the outlier? No. Would the FDA accept that? Heck no. Okay? Well, this comes from the IPCC report. And what they say is satellite measurements show an increase in temperature. Satellite measurements show an increase. This is the IPCC report. Who controls the satellites? NASA. Don't you think we should ask NASA what they think about the data and how they interpret it? Well, I know what the IPCC says. Okay? Here's what NASA says. Okay? No discernible warming trend in the Earth's lower atmosphere over the last 18 plus years. So NASA says one thing. They did the study. They did it. Their satellites. And the IPCC reached a totally different conclusion. Now, how do they get these measurements? Right? You got 3 different ways. You got satellite, you got balloon, and you got ground measurements. Well, the ground measurements are the worst of them because they're often on buildings like this, and there's something called an urban effect. Right? The thermometer might be on a tar roof. It might be next to a tarred road. Right? It might be near a city. Right? There's a whole bunch of problems that you run into when you got these little thermometers placed around the world. Okay? But if you look here, you have balloon, satellite, and direct temperature measurements. Okay? Balloon and satellite show no temperature increase. Only the ground temperatures that have an urban bias shows an increase. Now, that's not new to me. That may be new to you, but it's not new to everybody else. They know about this. Okay? NASA produced a report about it. Global climate monitoring, the accuracy of satellite data. Now, the problem is they insulted NASA. These are rocket scientists. You don't want to piss them off, right? Recently, much scientific debate has been focused on the global temperatures of the Earth's lower atmosphere as measured by orbiting satellites. And while these data are exceedingly precise, okay, rocket science, okay, verified by multiple satellite observations, that sounds like a hell of a science project to me, and balloon measurement taken in situ, meaning in that layer, okay, they reveal no discernible warming trend in the Earth's lower atmosphere over the last 18 plus years. Now remember, all the global warming they claim occurred in the last half a century. So you take 18 years out of it, you're dealing with only 30 years that all this global warming could have occurred. That's their whole argument. So if you take NASA's word for it, you're talking there must have been a window of 30 years where all this global warming occurred. Okay? So once again, if you're confused, we're going to get a little bit more confused. Okay? Once again, the Earth's been a lot warmer. They keep telling you that Earth's never been warmer. It's hitting record highs. The Vikings used to work and used to farm Greenland. This is Greenland. Okay? It's a chunk of ice today. Okay? They used to farm up there. It was a lot warmer. It was called the medieval warming period. Okay? Here's the temperature graphs. Okay? This is we're coming out of the little ice age. We're just getting back up to average. We're way below the peak within the last 1,000 years. Temperatures have been the last lot warmer just in the last 1,000 years. And I tell you what, there's no V8 engine in this thing. They're not driving Hummers. They're floating around in boats. Okay? And if you go back even further, temperatures got even higher. Okay? More importantly, the Arctic used to be as warm as Florida. You have to go back real far. But the Arctic used to be as warm as Florida. Okay? But once again, they didn't have SUVs back then. Here's just one more chart. Many, many periods of global warming and global cooling. Okay? This is something that I found kind of interesting because if you look at the data, they got a real problem. It's called the medieval warming period. Is how do they explain that? We're not even back to that level. Right? This is from a report that I was able to find. I'm a geologist, and he basically said he gives us credentials. Okay? This is one of the comments that he makes that's kind of telling. Around 1996, I became aware of how corrupt and ideologically driven current climate research can be. A major researcher working in the area of climate change confided in me that the factual record needed to be altered. This is Orwell type stuff. Dude, you know, it was 1984. Okay, we got the record keepers rewriting history. Okay, factual record needed to be altered so that people would become alarmed over global warming. He said we have to get rid of the medieval warming period. And the reason they have to get rid of it is because they got people like me going around, guys, how do you explain this? Okay? That's why the hockey stick comes in and they play around these funny names and they get a flat chart, flat temperature gauge during the medieval warming period. Okay? Once again, these aren't my words, this is David Deming. He saw the same problem I did and he went on record about it. Okay? Here's another thing. This is a scientist addressing the fact that they're trying to erase the fact that there's this medieval warming period. The facts are simple. Little optimum and little ice age were real. They were also widespread over the globe, unlike just the northern hemisphere. The 20th century is not the least bit climatically unusual. So why the recent media hysteria that the 20th century is the warmest in the last 1,000 years? This comes from so-and-so PhD from the Harvard Smithsonian Center in Astrophysics. Okay? The reason I put this here is just within our own history. We became a nation during the Little Ice Age. And we're all worried about global warming. Look at what happened. Go back and read the history of what the winters were like back when George Washington was crossing the Delaware. This is all ice. The Delaware River used to freeze over. It never freezes over today. Okay? People died by the thousands, if not millions, back in this time. The French Revolution, when Marie Antoinette said, let them eat cake, they were starving. Why were they starving? Because the Little Ice Age had destroyed all the crops. Good old Louis lost his head over the Little Ice Age. Global cooling leads to social revolution and a lot of death. Go back and look at what happened during the Little Ice Age, all the social revolutions. Our revolution, the French Revolution, and a large part of it had to do with, basically over in Europe, had to do with the fact that the crops were failing. Okay? But believe me, given two choices, global warming or global cooling, I take global warming any day. Okay? You feed people when things are warm. People starve when they're cold. Okay, don't fall asleep yet. We've all had, I'm assuming everybody knows a little bit about science, correlations, how to do a scientific study, how you have cause and effect. Okay? Correlation does not prove causation. You know, I used to work in the financial industry. You know, they used to always use an example. Tree grows higher over time. Stock market goes higher over time. The tree did not cause the stock market to go higher. Okay? Theory explains the relationship. Right? So if I can come up with some kind of theory that because that tree's going higher, the stock market is going higher through maybe more oxygen in the air, making people feel better, and consumer confidence goes higher. Okay? You'd have to do something like that. Okay? Both stocks and the birth rates have been declining in Europe. Declining stocks does not cause the declining birth rate. Okay? There's no link. There's no theory combining them. Okay? And I just use this as an example that this is a lens. And this basically just shows that increase in exposure time to a dye will decrease the transparency. So you can see there's a gradient there. And I have a theory that the longer you expose this lens to a dye, the transparency is going to go down. Then I test it. Then I do a measurement, and sure enough, it comes back, yeah, you're right. Okay? If I make a claim that things fall at 9.8 meters per second squared, I go out there and measure a bunch of things falling, and I let the data tell me what the conclusion is. Okay? Once again, cause and effect. Making something boil. Okay? I turn the burner on first, and then the water boils. The timing is critical. I have to turn the burner on first. The flame causes the water to boil. Never does the water boil and then the temperature gets turned up. If I came to you and I said, you don't want to know what causes the flame to turn on? The water boiling? You'd say I was nuts, right? Is there anyone in this room that would say I've lost my mind? My theory is that water boiling turns on the stove. Does that make any sense at all? this is critical. You got to disagree with me if you believe in global warming, because if not, you're going to get it. Okay? Nobody in this room would disagree with me that turning on that burner causes the water to boil. The theory is CO2 causes temperature to increase, right? Therefore, CO2 must increase first, and then temperature must increase. Does anyone disagree with that? CO2 has to increase first, and then temperature.
You have a positive feedback loop going on too, because as temperatures get warming, CO2 also is increased by increased biomass.
So you're arguing that
temperature
can...
It actually feeds on itself.
Okay. It's a compound mechanism, but still, CO2 must increase first before the feedback starts to feedback anyways. You gotta keep trying. Let's take a look at what the data says. Okay? This is Al Gore. This is the one where he gets in the chart. Okay? He gets on this little lip and he starts screaming about CO2. Right off the bat, you can start to see a little something's wrong with his theory, because CO2 is going higher and temperatures are going lower. These people aren't stupid. They're thinking like I'm thinking. They know how to run a correlation just as well as everybody else. And guess what happens when they run a correlation? Okay? Oh, this is what I got out of line here. This is when I asked Lori Davis the question. This is the chart I asked her about. She claimed that I didn't know what I was talking about. I told her that in her own chart it showed CO2 going to record highs, but temperatures were decreasing. She disagreed with me. Who was there? Zach, you were there? Didn't she get real defensive? She didn't have a lot of follow credit, and she said my eyes were lying to me. Right? That's what she said. In so many words. And she wouldn't take a follow-up question. Well, let's take a look, Lori. Well, first of all, let's go back and take a look at this. This is Al Gore's chart, by the way. Peak 1, peak 2, peak 3, peak 4, peak 5. All of them higher than today's temperatures. Okay? Nothing's near their level of CO2. So right off the bat, her own chart doesn't make her case. Let's zoom in. My point, CO2s were falling from the most recent peak. It is true. Actually, more appropriate would have been this peak. It's still declining. So no matter what recent peak you use, it's declining.
You're talking about temperature, not CO2.
Temperature. Yeah, it's a temperature. So, Lori, my eyes don't lie. You just didn't understand the chart you had. But it shows you the sophistication of the people going around giving these presentations. Let's take a look at the data. Let's zoom in. This is from Woods Hole again. This is the type of stuff they use in the IPCC report. I just chose this one because it's the most dramatic example. CO2 is extremely high. You go back here and you look at all these things. I picked out the periods. CO2 is extremely high. Temperature falls through the floor. So if CO2 is causing temperature to rise, why when CO2 remains so doggone high is temperature falling through the floor? This is their chart, not mine. Help me explain that one. Okay, I mean, Al, did you look at the charts that you're using? I don't think you did. Okay? Go back to the experts. Why does the lag of CO2 behind temperature in the ice core tell us about global warming? They know it lags. And they keep telling you that there's a cause and effect. They claim that temperatures increase 600 to 1,000. The other studies I saw show 800 to 1,400 years. CO2 doesn't do anything. Temperature increases for a full 1,000 years, 1,400 years, before CO2 even starts to increase. That's like saying the water's boiling today, and 1,400 years later I turn the burner on. That's what they're saying. Their conclusion is, does this prove global warming? No. You can click on this and go get their explanation. You do this kind of study in any other science, go talk to your statistics professor about this. Don't tell him you're working on global warming. Just tell him this is your conclusion. Tell him that the cause occurred 1,400 years in the future, and the effect occurred today. He's going to say F minus. Okay? The moment you tell him it's global warming, oh, it starts to make sense. Okay? Something in the water. This is their data, though. They will tell you temperature increases 1,400 years before CO2. Temperature drives CO2. CO2 does not drive temperature. And if you think through natural biology, that makes sense. You have to warm the earth before things start to grow, right? Things don't live in the Arctic. They live in the tropical zone. Once they start to live, they start producing CO2. Okay? Once again, I encourage anyone to strip the fact that this is global warming away, take this kind of data and conclusions to a statistics professor or any person in the hard sciences and tell them this is what you're reaching and watch their reaction. They've got the horse in front of the carriage. They got things backwards. Okay? Once again, like I said, just take this to a statistics professor. They would have a heyday with it. Here's another one, Wood's oil research. Okay? What I did with this one, this is their data. Okay? This is CO2. And as you can see, the slope of the CO2 changes dramatically. Now, anytime you're doing any kind of a normal research project and you see something dramatically change like that, you immediately scratch your head. If you're doing research on a drug and all of a sudden you start seeing the blood pressure or something on a patient shoot through the roof, you say, well, something's different here, right? Well, sure enough, they're using the different data samples. So their data samples have totally different characteristics. But even using their own charts, the CO2, the slope of the CO2 increase is rapidly increasing versus this. So if the CO2 is rapidly increasing and it's causing temperature to increase, you'd expect temperature to rapidly start increasing also. Well, this period, this is the slope of the temperature during this period. I just simply did a parallel shift to this other red one. The slope during these two periods are essentially the same for the temperature. But more importantly, during this period of rapid increase of CO2, temperatures actually fell between 1940 and 1980. If anything, it's a weak correlation, certainly not very strong. Okay? But once again, you have changes of rates. Not only changes of level, changes of rates of increase. That's huge. But the temperature doesn't change at all. Okay? We the sheep. There's a consensus out there. Who's been told there's a consensus? I just came from a lecture that they drove home the message, there's a consensus. Did anyone go to that thing a little bit ago when they attacked global warming skeptics like myself? It was pretty interesting.
I believe the figure was 99% of the climate scientists.
Yes. Bottom line is there's no one out there who disagrees with this stuff. Well, I tell you one thing, if they do agree with that kind of science, we got some real problems. Don't ever buy a drug created by a global scientist, I'll tell you that. Okay? Al Gore says it. 0. People disagree with this stuff, right? This is from his book. Okay? He makes a case. If you disagree with him, you're way off. Okay? I don't make an argument if you agree with him. Go back to Science 101. Okay? Here's my argument. There's 0 Nobel Prizes given for global warming. Okay? The consensus is just a complete 180 degrees from where it was just 30 years ago. Within my lifetime, I saw the entire paradigm shift from one end of the spectrum to the other. I was living in an igloo hut one day, I'm living in the tropical zone the next. In his movie, who's seen Inconvenient Truth? Remember when he mocks the scientific consensus about the planets? Right? He mocks the scientific consensus twice. He used to say, well, they used to say smoking was good for you. And he makes it mocking about the scientific consensus that the continents were never connected. So even he doesn't put a lot of faith in the scientific consensus unless it agrees with him. Okay? And once again, within my very own time period. And last of all, that's not how you reach the science. You don't reach the truth just because everyone agrees with you. Back in 1492, if I would have said, how many people think, or how many scientists out there think that the Earth is flat? Everybody would raise their hand. That doesn't make the Earth flat. It just makes them not very smart. Okay? Well, today everyone's agreeing that there's global warming. Okay, this comes from a quote from one of the basically scientific skeptics out there. Also, in scientific discussion, sometimes the sentiment of the generally accepted view of the scientific community is heard as if verification or falsification of the scientific hypothesis is a matter of majority vote. That's not how you reach the truth. A derogatory statement. He also points out that anybody who disagrees with the global warming scientists, he's basically, saying, get ready, they're going to attack you. Derogatory statements about a person's scientific reputation are least helpful. He's been through the ringer. He knows what happens when you speak out against the herd. He basically calls it authority through the majority. Okay? Here's some more quotes. This is from, I'm not even trying to pronounce his name. It's big news. Okay? Once again, you can click on this, go to research. This is how he, like, how I'm showing you all the data, and I'm showing you the problems that I see. Well, he did the same thing. He basically, the ice samples are based on fudged data. I don't know what fudged data is, but it doesn't sound good to me. And ignorance of the physical process of glacial ice formation. That's as close to a smackdown as you're going to get in the scientific community. When they start using terms like that, look out. From its very beginning, the hypothesis of anthropogenic greenhouse warming was tainted with a biased selection of data, which is what I pointed to, ad hoc assumptions that were not verified experimentally, and one-sided interpretations. This is someone else's conclusion, but I think from what I just showed you, you would probably reach the same conclusion. I don't have a PhD after my name, though. Okay? Here's another one. When they're talking about this global consensus, well, this comes from the land of Lord Churchill. Something's wrong with my fonts on this projector for some reason. Okay? But if you're out in Colorado and you start disagreeing with global warming, you got to think this guy's pretty brave or something's up. But this is a Colorado State professor disputes global warming as human cause. This was just recently. Once again, you can click on it. Global warming is happening, but humans are not the cause. One of the nation's top experts on hurricanes said Monday morning. Bill Gray, he basically says that it's not due to global warming. I mean, not due to man. Man-induced global warming is a fear perpetuated by the media and scientists who are trying to get federal grants. I think we're coming out of the little ice age, which is what he's pointing out, which is what, when you look at the chart, that's what we're doing. And warming is due to changes in the ocean circulation patterns due to salinity variations. There's another possible cause of global warming which you never hear about. Okay. Here are just some more things. I basically just get the CD, go click on it. In 1998, 17,000 scientists, 6 of whom are Nobel laureates, signed the Oregon petition, which declared in part, there's no convincing scientific evidence that human release of greenhouse gases is causing or will in the foreseeable future cause catastrophic heating of the earth. Okay? Their consensus seemed to have forgotten 17,000 people. Okay? Even the French have joined in. This is just this week. October 17, 2006. Decorated scientist defects from belief in global warming. Caps a year of vindication for skeptics. All right. Okay? He addresses Al Gore's Kilimanjaro. He points out over here that Al Gore wrote that the cause of climate change remains unknown and pointed out that Kilimanjaro is not losing snow due to global warming, but to a local land use and precipitation changes. So he basically does what I'm doing. He takes one of Al Gore's charts and said, that's bogus anyways. Okay? Now let's go take a look, and we're going to back up to Science 101. We're just going to take a look at the natural cycle anyways. Where's all this stuff coming from? What exactly, how does Mother Nature work? What's all this hype about global warming? Well, this is the carbon cycle. Right? And once again, if you're going to do scientific study, you look for the most significant variables. If I'm going to do a study on weight loss, I look at the caloric intake, the amount of exercise. Okay? I wouldn't look at what type of shoes they're wearing or how many cars they have in the garage. Those are probably going to be pretty insignificant. I look at the big guns, caloric intake and the exercise, right? So if you're going to look at global warming, you think, let's look at where all the CO2 comes from. That's probably most likely a small tweak in a big fish is a lot more likely than a big increase in small fish. So look here. What does Mother Nature do? The oceans create most of our CO2. Right? Huge amounts of CO2. I bet you didn't even know that. I'm just going to put this in relative scales because these are billions of tons. So you've got a scale of 100 to 115 being circulated by the oceans. Okay? Plants breathing produce 40 to 50. How many people knew trees created CO2? All right. I ask that normally. People go, I don't know that. Plants create CO2. Are you nuts? Okay. Decay and residue creates another 50 to 60. Put this thing in perspective. Man produces 5. Trees breathing create 10 times more CO2 than we do. Right? And that's not even a big contributor. Okay? The oceans are. Man's a drop in the bucket. Right? More importantly, everyone's had chemistry. Everyone knows what a titration is, right? Everyone knows what a buffer is. If you don't have a saturated buffer, what happens if you increase the concentration of something? It just gets dissolved, right? Like with hemoglobin and when you're breathing, right? You breathe in oxygen, it increases the partial pressure of oxygen, so it binds to the hemoglobin. The hemoglobin goes to some area where the partial pressure of oxygen is low, and it releases it, right? Well, there's something called the Henry's Law, and this is something the global warming people can never get away with, unless they can prove that the oceans are saturated with CO2. Henry's Law is the law of the fusion of gas and liquid. Mother Nature regulates CO2 through the oceans. If we put more CO2 up in the atmosphere and the partial pressure was too high for where she wanted it, she'd absorb it in the ocean. So if we pulled CO2 out, Mother Nature would simply release it. It's like the blood supply of the ocean. There's no way they can get away from Henry's Law. Okay? If we go around and stop producing CO2 and Mother Nature doesn't like it, she has a temperature and a pressure that she targets. We pull CO2 out, she's going to pump more out through the oceans. Unless they can show that the oceans are saturated with CO2, which they're not. Also, if you look at who produces CO2, Mother Nature produces a heck of a lot. Forests, there's 500,000 forest fires burning just right now. You know, each one of these trees going up is an SUV full of smoke. Right? Huge amounts. Mother Nature, when she produces, she pollutes big. Okay? She pollutes so much that in one volcano, she can create a year without a sun. Okay. Recently, I locked in the domain internetskeptic.com, and this is one of the first presentations that we were able to get up and running. We have one out there right now for ethanol. And if you want to take a look at some of the things that we're working on, the ethanol one gives a very good idea. What we typically do is we go out and we find these politically interesting topics like global warming. And in this scenario, what we do is we take the data that they provide, take a look at it, and see if it shows or proves what they're trying to say. A lot of this data you'll see in Al Gore's movie, and what we're going to do is we're just going to take it and we're going to apply a critical eye to it and see, does the data really support the conclusions that they reach within the movie, or is there something really behind this global warming? Basically, I'm just going to present the data, and what I hope you're going to say is that's not true. Because everything that you're going to see here will basically be supported by the documents that support it right behind it. And that's why I gave you the discs. When you have these discs, you can go home and take a look at it. And every one of the charts, every one of the little quotes will have a link to it. So you just click on it and it'll take you to the source so that you can see for yourself that the data that we're using here is actually real. And it's basically being used to create arguments that I think you'll see really aren't supported by the facts. All right, well, let's get started here. And I do encourage you to take a look at the global warming or the Internet Skeptic website. Well, what are they saying? How many people, by the way, has seen Al Gore's movie? All right, well, it's worth seeing because it's a very good work as far as propaganda goes. And you'll see why in a little bit. 52. Exactly. It's basically a donation to his campaign. What are they saying? They're saying man-made CO2 is causing global warming. Man-made CO2 has pushed atmospheric CO2 to record highs. Temperatures are at historic highs. That there is a scientific consensus behind global warming. And Al Gore is not running for president. Right? So those are what they're saying. Does anyone disagree with what's up there? I mean, if I went out there and asked someone on the street, would anyone disagree with any of those comments that I just made there?
Yeah, I would.
What would you disagree with, George?
All of them.
I mean, but this is would you agree this is the conventional wisdom?
Well, that's what they're saying.
CO2, man causes CO2 to increase. That increase in CO2 has led to global warming. There's a cause and effect.
Well, the first argument is a tautology. It's a circular argument. You have to assume that global warming exists. You can say that.
Yeah.
And we haven't even established global warming exists.
Yeah. But pretty much the theory, at least that Al Gore will provide, is that man increases CO2, which leads to an increase in temperature. And here's what they have. Now this actually comes from a presentation that we went to down at OSU. We went down and had a guy from Berkeley, and I'll have a little bit of his data here in a second. And these come right from his presentation. So when you get your CD, you can go put it in there, you can go click on these images, and it takes you right to this global warming experts website. And this is the data that he shows. This is the whole basis behind their theory. Over here you have CO2. You have atmospheric CO2 over time. So you have time on the x-axis, and then you have parts per million over here. So as you can see, CO2 has been increasing. Right? Here you have man's production of CO2. You have, once again, the amount, and over time, gas, oil, coal, nuclear. But as you can see that man's been producing a lot more CO2. Atmospheric CO2 is going up. It's a no-brainer. Man's causing atmospheric CO2 to go up. That's the whole theory. And down here is actually what he says. This comes from flip that back. Okay, down here, the increase in atmospheric CO2 is primarily due to world energy consumption and secondarily due to deforestation. That's a definitive statement. There's two causes, man. Deforestation and the production of basically burning fossil fuels, world energy. That is their quote. That's their quote. And once again, you can click on that link and it'll take you right to his website. And this is, by the way, this is the guy that is so prominent that they brought him to OSU. This is what OSU holds up. There's John Hart, Energy and Resources Group, University of California, Berkeley. Global warming, why the skeptics are wrong. That's me. And why I'm wrong. And we saw him down at the Fawcett Center. Here is his chart. Okay? Once again, you have temperature and atmospheric CO2. The thing here, though, is, if you notice here, here's the previous peak of atmospheric CO2. Here's where the current level is. On these charts that they show, they'll show you that CO2 is at a level never seen before, ever. On any chart they'll show that this level of 370 CO2 has never been reached before, at any time before in world history. Okay? Here's a little fly in the ointment, though. While the CO2 is way higher than ever before, temperatures are actually dropping since the recent peak 10,000 years ago. Okay? So, temperatures are at record highs. Okay? Right there you have it. MSN's first half of 2006, warmest on record in the U.S. You can't argue with that. There's a scientific consensus. Right there it is. Washington Post. Undeniable global warming. There is a scientific consensus on the fact that Earth's climate is heating up and human activities are part of the reason. No ifs, ands, or buts. Okay? Down here with the CD, once again, you can click here, and you got Sir David Attenborough telling you that there's a scientific consensus. There's no doubt out there. This global warming is real. Man's causing it, and we've got to stop it. The problem is, we've been there before. When I was growing up, I didn't fear global warming. I feared a coming ice age. Many of you people are probably my age, and you probably remember this. When you take a look at it, once again, you have scientific consensus. Now, this comes from back in 1975. Okay? And as you see there, it's called Global Cooling, came out of Newsweek. And when you read this article, you'll see that there was a scientific consensus. Back then, there was a media blitz. Okay? There was an educational blitz. I remember being taught about it. Okay? Political motives. One of Jimmy Carter's big thing was the green, the solar power, the energy crisis. There was a whole group of political motives back then. And there was a lot of wasted money. And I saw this firsthand. I used to work at 32nd Street in San Diego, which was a naval base. And they had, on top of their clinic, they had all these solar panels. Okay? They were put in back in the 70s. They're all broken. Total waste. So what happened after the 70s, as you know, the energy prices fell. And so he spent a bunch of money. And the key was, back then, the scientific consensus was dead wrong. Within 30 years, we've gone from global cooling, coming ice age, to global warming.
Why were they wrong?
Why were they wrong? Because, well, we'll get to that. Okay? What's kind of interesting, though, is if you take a look at what they said back then. Okay? Back then, what was the culprit? They couldn't blame CO2. So they said back then it was the sun was getting weaker. So the sun's output was cooling. Right? So right there's the first fly in the ointment, because they're saying the sun is responsible for the temperature of the earth. Yeah, okay. Who could have thought that one up? And what was so funny, though, is today they're all worried about the melting ice cap, right? Back then, they wanted to melt the ice cap. This is one of their proposals, such as melting the Arctic ice cap by covering it with black soot. They were going to warm the Earth back then by melting the ice cap. I wish I'd make this stuff up, but I'm not. Okay? Here's another thing back then. Oh, by the way, did anyone listen to WTBN on the way to work, or the way here today? About 5:45? Well, it turns out that the agricultural productivity in the world is actually quite high right now. But back then, there was a consensus, but they almost unanimously in the view that the trend would reduce agricultural productivity more thing. Back then, once again, there was a unanimous view that this global cooling was going to cause all these problems, which did not turn out to be correct. But once again, that's a good argument against the global warming. The other thing is the fear tactics that they would use. Few signs that the government leaders anywhere are even prepared to take the simple measures of stockpiling food. Now, if we would have stockpiled food back then, what would we be doing with it now? A lot of people would have been starving, and all that food would have gone to waste. It would have been a total boondoggle. Okay? But once again, the other part there, for some reason, they were shooting through. It went on the same thing. That it basically shows that they're using fear tactics to show that the government's not paying attention, or is not responding. Okay, here's something that came out of National Geographic. Okay, and this is what I kind of found kind of interesting. This is back once again when they were claiming global cooling was coming on. Back then, experts agree they cannot yet predict climate change with any assurance. And that pretty much holds today, too. They can't tell you what the weather's going to be like in a week, let alone 100 years from now. Warmer climates, back then, warmer climates were actually viewed favorably. If you see over here, it says higher temperatures might actually increase arable land. So back then, when they were fearing ice age, they said, well, we'd rather have global warming because you get nice farmland, you can grow more, things like that. So back then, when they were trying to create this type about global cooling, they were trying to build up global warming. Okay? Down here, where they talk about global cooling, lower temperatures could produce a climate generally wetter and less stable, one marked by storms, floods, and freezes. Other than the freezes, that's what they're using today. Global warming is causing floods, storms, and hurricanes. Right? So global cooling causes it, global warming causes it. Pick and choose whatever you want. It's because they'll use anything they want to make their argument. And like I said, I wish I could make this stuff up, but it's not. Okay, this is the one that I really remember as a kid. You might remember that show In Search Of. Leonard Nimoy would get out there and he'd go look for Bigfoot, a bottomless snowman. The one that really caught my eye was back then he scared me to death with the coming ice age. I mean, I remember thinking, my God, we're going to run out of oil in 10 years. I'm going to freeze to death. And then it was inflation. I was thinking, I'm not going to have a job. But it was an absolutely horrible childhood growing up because they're all Leonard and these environmentalists were scaring me to death. All right? And that's it. I'm not joking about that. Okay. Here, not to confuse you or anything, but this is just in 2005. Believe it or not, they're back again. The mini ice age may be coming soon. You can't win them with them. They're going to cover themselves one way or another. So right now, you've got them arguing there's an ice age coming, and you've got them arguing there's a global warming coming. Either way, they're going to be right. You know? It's like arguing with a two-headed hydra or something. All right? So bottom line is they've got all bases covered. But what's the truth? Okay? Man-made CO2 is causing global warming. That's the argument. Right? That's what they're saying. Well, let's take a look at it. All right? That's the the chart that I just showed you that one of the preeminent global warming scientists uses. Okay? Right out of his report. Looks pretty good, right? Until you take a look at what it says. Mauna Loa, right?
It's a volcano, isn't it?
We're getting ice core data. If you take a look at what they've done, is they've taken data from the Arctic, and they've combined it with data from a volcano. Does that make any sense at all to anybody?
Well, that's good manipulation, isn't it?
Yeah. Now, we got some nurses here. If I brought a test to you and I said, I had a sample here of people with, let's say, diabetes, and then over here I had a sample of people with hypertension, right? And I combined those two to show you that what I was doing worked fantastically, and it actually started to increase with this group. But I didn't tell you that I had two different samples here, and yet I combined them. Would you ever trust that kind of a study? If I combine two totally dissimilar data sets, if I took, healthy people and unhealthy people and try to convince you that the theory worked without telling you that I combined the two, would you think that was a very credible study?
But where did you find this? It seems that part of it was just cut out of a larger presentation of the data.
Yeah, what I did was I zoomed in.
Oh, you separated them out.
Yeah, this is what it is. Now this is what caught my eye was, he gives this, when he's giving the presentation, he throws this up. But he never mentions the two data sets. It's like, he gives it to you, so he's not really fooling you.
So let me just make sure I understand this. So the curve going up is supposed to show the same continuous curve ascending, but
Yes.
here in reality, instead of ice core data all the way up.
You got it. This is all
It's a
CO2.
volcano.
So
That's
this is all CO2 data, right? But this data is ice core data.
That's like from Greenland or something, right?
It's from what's called Vosslock ice Antarctica. And then this is from Mauna Loa.
hysterical.
Maybe.
Yeah, it gets better though. It gets better. Okay, this isn't the worst.
The ice has melted and they can't get ice core data
That's right.
anymore.
The global warming has melted all the ice.
We'll get to that. We'll get to that. Okay. Yeah. Once again, I'm just blowing up so you can see. That's not. Once again, this is not my chart. This is their chart. Okay. So what you got here? This is literally what they're doing. This is what they're doing with ice core. Now, the important thing here is this is Antarctica. There's no biomass up there. There's no factories. There's no volcano spewing CO2. There's no decomposition. There's no respiration. It's very dry air. And there's no CO2, anything producing CO2 up there. Zip. And so they go and they go dig down into the ice to get these.
Why would they even bring in that, the carbon dioxide from the...
Okay. Well, that's my point. That's where we're getting. Okay. Once again, then you've got this guy, and remember, these are core samples, drilled down, taken out of core samples. Here they've got flask data. They take a little jar, hold it up, cap it, measure it. Taken from, once again, the top of a volcano. Elevated 14,000 feet, surrounded by warm, CO2 spewing oceans and tropical forests and volcanoes. Okay, and they combined these two data sets. Explain it. Why wouldn't they just take flash data from Antarctica? Because they have to go down deep to get the core samples, and it's going to end at this. It's going to start 100 some years ago. But why would they just use flash data from Antarctica? That would be my first question. Why are they manipulating the data in this manner? Yeah, because it doesn't work. Okay? Well, here is a statement from one of the guys who actually did the research. And what he found was that he goes up there and he does all this research, they take all these core samples, and what he found was that the environmentalists got a hold of it and they were using the data in a manner that it wasn't intended. Okay, this is a statement written for the hearing before the U.S. Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, transportation, climate change, incorrect information on pre-industrial CO2. I have this guy's work up here, and it's really pretty amazing if you read it. You don't get to see this kind of critical analysis very often, but he does a good job. But he has his credentials. In the last 40 years, he was involved in glacier studies, using snow and ice as the matrix for reconstruction of the history of man-made pollution of the global atmosphere. A part of these studies was related to the climatic issues. Ice core records of CO2 have been widely used as proof that due to man's activity, a current atmospheric level of CO2 is about 25% higher than in the pre-industrial period. That's what I'm talking about. Okay? These records became the basic input parameters in the models of the global carbon cycle and a cornerstone of the man-made climatic warming hypothesis. So they took his data and it became the cornerstone. Okay? This is what he says. These records do not represent the atmospheric reality, as I will try to demonstrate in the statement. So the guy who comes up with a lot of the data basically says they're misusing the data that I created. Right? Right? Okay? Here are some of his, and this is what I'm saying, it's amazing some of the language this guy uses. Alright? And this comes from, once again, here's the report. If you have the CD, you can go click on it and it takes you right to it. Okay? There are many occasions where analytical data have not been validated or checked for their significance. In fact, this is what I love. It is common that environmental data are not subjected to normal statistical tests, as in their precision, variation, standard deviation, significance, or probability of difference. He basically says it's common for these people not to look at the data. You know, they don't. I mean, when we go through here, you'll see the scientific practices of this group is just awful. And we're just now starting to get into it. In environmental considerations, the final conclusion and the projection of future developments are often derived from model calculations for which they only inaccurately know base data. Basically, garbage in, garbage out. Just like I showed you, they just Moana Loa, Arctic ice cores. Which one go? Okay. I mean, the logic behind what they do doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Also, in scientific discussions, the other thing that you'll see when you do a lot of research for what goes on in the global warming community, you'll see that if you speak out against them, you get demonized, you get trashed, and they attack your credibility. And he mentions the same thing here. He says, also in scientific discussions, sometimes the sentiment of the generally accepted view of the scientific community is heard. Basically, they always come up. There's a consensus, which we'll get to in a little bit. Okay? As if verification or falsification of scientific hypothesis is a matter of majority vote. Is the world flat? Yep. Earth's flat. That's not how it's done. The data decides what's true, not whether or not everyone agrees with you. Okay? Derogatory statements about a person's scientific reputation. Okay? He also mentions that are least helpful, is what he says. So basically, he's making acknowledgement that he knows that if he says this, he's going to be attacked, but he's at least going to say it. And you'll see that quite often whenever you see these things, people are kind of like scared to death to mention anything. Here's another thing that he wrote. Attempts to support global warming thesis with analysis of the carbon dioxide contents of air bubbles and glacial ice samples are based on fudged data and ignorance of the physical processes of glacial ice formation. Alan Gordon must not have read that one. All right? But he fell right into it. I guarantee you Al didn't figure out the Moana Loa thing. From its very beginning, the hypothesis of anthropogenic, that's man-made greenhouse gas warming, was tainted with a biased selection data. And we're going to get to the biased data selection here coming up. Ad hoc assumptions and were not verified experimentally. Okay? The one-sided interpretations, and you'll see a lot of this one-sided interpretation, such as symptoms of affliction, which Irving so-and-so called the pathological science. So he's basically saying that they call the global warming people pathological science. They typically are trying to prove something instead of just trying to look into it and find out what's really going on. And we'll get that here in a minute.
Joe Borowski, is that
Yeah. Okay. Here's the actual data that he's complaining about. Right? This is the data on which we created that other chart, on which they used to create the other chart. You know the thing wrong with this?
There's a gap.
There's a gap. Right? And once again, these people don't seem to understand how to read charts. All right? Part of my background is economics, so I love these charts. And but you'll see here, the ice core data, because it has to come from down deep, it stops about 100 years ago. Right? Then they pick up with Mauna Loa, and they combine the two, right? But you notice, for one, there's a huge gap in time, and two, CO2, 100 years ago, is a lot higher than it was in 1950, right? So CO2, according to their own data, fell from 1890 to 1950.
Industrial age drop.
Yeah. And so if you look at it, the 1950 level was actually equal to the 1860 level. So over a full 90-year period, CO2 was flat. Okay? That's their data. However, how'd they get the one chart? This is what I love. Okay? In normal science, what would you do? You would probably never use these two data samples together. Okay? But how do you get that one chart that they showed? You simply shift the data 83 years. That's what they did. They said, okay, well, we got these two. They said, shift it over. Okay. That's what I mean by bunch data. Now, that's, once again, this is not my chart.
They didn't even do a normal extrapolation.
No. They just simply said, well,
I can understand the ice core thing because it's almost like tree rings. Because you can't go back 1 year with a tree ring. You got to go back. There's a discrete.
Sure. But why not fill that big void with a flash data? Why not go and get flash data?
In the same place.
Now, does the flash data exist during that time period?
No.
It does.
Oh, it does?
So they deliberately didn't use it. Matter of fact, they used some of the data. Okay? And here it is. Man-made CO2 is coming. This is the flash data.
What kind of data is clear?
This is the
Go out and get her.
yeah, I'm sorry. There's two types of source. There's core sample, like I showed the guy drilling, and the other one they take a core sample, just a flat
Air graph sample.
Air graph sample. They got it, and not only do they have it, there's no real need for that core samples because they've got it all the way back to 1810. Now, why wouldn't you just use the flash data? Can anyone explain?
Yeah, it doesn't match up.
It doesn't make right. Why? Because if you look back in 1810, atmospheric CO2 is 550. Okay? Today it's 370. Once again, last data shows CO2 decreasing. All right? And what this is, you're up here, Alex.
Well, these guys are sweethearts, aren't they?
Okay? Back then there's a maximum of 550, and that's right up here. The average is 335. Now you remember to what? Oh, thanks, Peter. The average is 335. The current level is 370. So in reality, if you use just the same type of data sample, we're barely above the average over the last 200 or so years. And more importantly, CO2 is nowhere near a high. This is nowhere near that. So if they think that is a high, we're nowhere near an atmospheric high if you use the same data approach. Okay? And once again, this isn't my data. Okay? Bingo. And right there you have it. Okay? Al Gore somehow thinks this level is higher than that level. Okay? In order to create an average to make it look like the CO2 was lower back then, these circle data is what they used as the average.
We learned that in divinity school.
I don't know. Justifies his lower SAT score. What makes that data? Why do you choose that? Is there anything more?
Well, the circle data here is what they did was they wanted to have an average so that they could show that the CO2 was increasing. So they cherry picked this data, which out of this data set resulted in a lower average of CO2, so they could show a higher climb.
So in the original data set, there's nothing to set those apart from other samples?
My fault.
Like the ones they circled, they're...
Well, the ones that they sort of, what they did here was they wanted to use an average of the thing. By choosing this data set, which
choosing was just entirely random.
Total random. Okay? Of course, why would you do that? I don't know why you would do it, but when you go back and you take an average of all the data set, it's a higher average. Okay? Once again, I hope that you're not believing any of this because the links will take you source. This is another one, and to show you how incestuous this data is, this is from another source. In the fine print, once again, it's the Mauna Loa data combined with ice cores. Go find any chart out there, you'll see what they do is they use this bad data on everywhere. Okay? Once again, you have thousands of years, time, you have temperature, and you have CO2. All right? Okay. Now take a look at this. This is another flaw. The whole theory is increase in CO2 leads to increase in temperature, right? Cause and effect. CO2 goes up, temperature goes up. Here's a horizontal line showing you the peaks of temperature in the previous cycles. Now these cycles last about 100,000 years. You typically have 100,000 years of ice age, 10,000 years of warming, 100,000 years of ice age. We're overdue for the next ice age, by the way. Okay? But if you notice here, here's the peak of temperature. This is their own chart. Here is the temperature recently. It's well off the peak 10,000 years ago. So temperatures have been falling, and yet their own chart shows CO2 going through the roof. Once again, never before in history, these are all the peaks of CO2 prior, have you been anywhere close to 370. This is a full 30% higher than ever before in history. Now you would assume that if CO2 is at record highs, the temperature would at least be close to a record. It's not even at a 10,000 year high. So where's the cause and effect? If there is a cause and effect, it's pretty weak, using their own data. Okay, here's the same thing. It's just another chart. I added a little thing there. No SUVs back then, but the CO2 got up there. Note how I use this one just because of the dramatic nature on which they present these things. They stop the chart and then the guy hand draws in 370 parts per million to show you that this thing is way off the charts. This is once again 400,000 years. Okay? And this basically, once again, here's the Vlasov ice core. This one doesn't bother to mention that this part here is Mauna Loa. They just kind of like forget that. Here, once again, though, you can see the peaks. The temperature recently is way off the previous peaks. So we aren't even near a peak of a cycle, and yet CO2 is off the charts. Right? Cause and effect. Okay, once again, everyone knows cause and effect. The cause has to occur first, right? Right? I get punched, then I get a bloody nose. Right?
Keep it up.
I drink a fifth of vodka, then I get drunk. Right? It would make no sense if I am drunk today and drink a fifth of vodka 800 years in the future, right? That doesn't make any sense at all. Well, that's what happens. Right? What I do is I zoomed in on this one just to show you the cause and effect. I took this slice, which is one of the peaks, to show you what happens. CO2 remains very high, flat. Temperature, however, plummets, falls through the floor. Let's go back on that. That's important. Okay? Temperature is right, or CO2 is right here. CO2 stays the same, and yet temperature falls through the floor. Right? Now, if CO2 was causing temperature to increase, how could you have high levels of CO2 and temperature fall through the floor? It doesn't make sense. What does temperature fall rapidly during the period of high CO2 levels? It just simply doesn't make sense. Okay? And the reason for it is, well, here's another one, cause and effect. Right? Once again, here is another chart shown differently. CO2, okay, temperature. But if you look at the chart, you'll see that this level of temperature in 1890 is above where it was in about 1975. So you have essentially flat temperatures over that time period, and yet CO2 goes from 290 up to about 330. So you have continual increase in CO2, but essentially stable to flat temperatures. Okay? Then recently, temperatures have begun to pick up.
But is that part on the right, the Mauna Loa again?
Yeah, in that case, it's Mauna Loa. Okay? But here's what I find most fascinating, is in any kind of normal science, if you had your cause and effect, your independent dependent variable reversed, just say, that's a joke, throw it out, right? If I did a study on aspirin causing headaches, and I waited for the patient headache to resolve, and then I gave them the aspirin, okay, I'd be able to prove my aspirin works pretty well if I model it that way. But the aspirin, there's no way for the aspirin to cure the headache if it's taken after the headache cures itself, right? The CO2 data itself Why does the lag of CO2 behind temperature and ice cores tell us about global warming? Or what does it? Okay? So it's well known in the scientific community that CO2 doesn't lead temperature. Temperature leads CO2 by 800 or 600 to 1,000 years. So what that means is temperatures increase today, then 1,000 years later, CO2 increases. There's no way for CO2 to increase 1,000 years in the future to cause temperature to increase today, right? That's like, once again, it's like me getting drunk today and drinking 1,000 years from now. Doesn't make any sense. They got their independent variables worked out. Let me see. This, by the way, comes from real climate science from climate scientists. So they're well aware of this. This is from their own work.
So is that why when you have a bottle of champagne and it's cold, it doesn't fizz as much as it's warm?
We'll get to that in a minute. That's another part coming up. But the bottom line is that cause and effect is simply are backwards. Okay? Basic Science 101. Oh, and the reason I burned these CDs, because I thought this would be a great example for a science project or for kids to see. Because this is basically a critical analysis and understanding scientific studies. Like you always had those classes that explain the independent variable and cause and effect, and you never knew what the heck's going on. This is a great way to really have people understand what's going on. They can see, CO2 increases, temperature increases, or temperature increases and CO2 increases. Okay? And so, if you take that CD, if you know any kids, have them take it into their science fair project, they can always contact me and I'd love to come in and give a talk. Basic Science 101, the independent variable causes the dependent variable to change. Basic Science 101, the independent variable causative agent must lead the dependent variable, i.e. I exercise, then I lose weight. Losing weight does not cause me to exercise. Temperature leads CO2 by 600 to 1,000 years. And that makes sense. Okay? An increase in CO2 1,000 years in the future cannot cause an increase in temperature today unless we were living in the Twilight Zone. Unless you have a time machine or something, but it just doesn't make sense. And the laws of science and common sense do not cease to exist in the global warming departments of our universities. Okay? Basic scientific practices have to be followed, whether you're a global warming scientist or not. You can't have your cause and effect reversed.
But then, Bob, what does cause the temperature increase?
The sun.
Solar flares.
Solar flares. No, we'll get to that, Hildegard. We got it coming up. We got all the bases covered.
Well, the one that are global are mini ice age from like the 14th century to about the 18th century, Bob.
Oh yeah, we'll get that. You can use your. We got all. Okay, temperatures are at historic highs. Chart shows that we are far below the peaks of previous cycles. Their own charts show that, not mine. We are below the peak of just 10,000 years ago. Once again, we're actually cooling from 10,000 years ago. Medieval period was warmer than today. Okay?
Didn't have that CD.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. How did CO2 get so high back then with no SUVs or coal-burning power plants? And we were just getting back to the pre-little ice age temperatures. Right? This is what, has anyone read the book, State of Fear? Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I got this one from State of Fear because he talks about, a lot of the problem is these continual data samples. Right? You saw the core samples and then the Mauna Loa. Okay? Global warming is kind of a new science, so they have to come up with these proxy stuff. Well, the longest direct measurement of temperature is the Albany, New York weather station. It goes back to the early 1800s. Well, this is actually from their data, and once again, click on it, it'll take you right there. And you'll see back the average temperature in 1822, 49.2. The average temperature in 2005, 49.2. So if you keep the same measurement technique, there's no global warming, at least according to Albany, New York. And they keep talking about these thinning ice caps. At least according to science, the ice caps are thickening, not thinning. Alright? So if you use consistent data samples, you start to see that their theory begins to break down. Alright, now another thing that you do in science, anytime you do an experiment, you might do it 2 or 3 different ways to confirm it, right? You have 2 or 3 different ways to skin a cat. You do 2 or 3, and if 2 of them kind of confirm each other and one of them is an outlier, what would you normally think you'd do?
Drop it out.
You drop the outlier, right? You got 2 confirming systems and one that says it's way out of whack. You throw the one that's way out of whack, right? That's not what they do. Okay? There's three ways to measure temperature. Direct temperature measures, surface, satellite, and balloon. Satellite and balloon temperature do not show warming over the last 20, 30 years. Okay? Only the ground temperature measurements show global warming, and there's problems with it because a lot of times they have the thermometer on a car roof next to a blacktop driveway. So there's big problems with surface temperatures. The satellite temperatures, however, and the balloon temperatures do not show global warming. More importantly, I want to show you something. Okay, this is a report from the IPCC, the International Panel of Climate Change. This is the report that they say. And it says here that the lowest 8 kilometers of the atmosphere has changed by 0.05 degrees. So the IPCC has a report that says temperatures are increasing. Using this data, they claim temperature is increasing, right? What does NASA say? NASA says global climate monitoring the accuracy of satellite data, no discernible trend in Earth's atmosphere over the last 18 plus years. Okay? More importantly, I think it's on the next one, but the key is the data that the IPCC uses for the political motives shows global warming. NASA says there's not. Okay, here's what they say. Global climate monitoring the accuracy of satellite data. Recently, much scientific debate has focused on the global temperature of the Earth's lower atmosphere as measured by orbiting satellites. Now get this. And while these data are exceedingly precise, verified by multiple satellite observations and balloon measurements taken in situ, they reveal no discernible warming trend in the Earth's lower atmosphere over the last 18 plus years. That to me sounds like a well-run scientific project. Some guys taking multiple samples, multiple approaches, very accurate measurement data. NASA says it's a bunch of bunk, right? And once again, here you have the surface data and the satellite data. Surface data, once again, is biased due to something called the urban effect. Okay? Once again, they're taking these things near highways and very warm bodies. Satellite is much more unbiased. And NASA says this global warming stuff doesn't hold. Well, let's take a look back. They keep saying this is the hottest time ever. It's not even close to the hottest time ever. This is the temperature data. Temperature over here. Time here. Recent time here. As you can see, the medieval period was a lot warmer. The Vikings used to farm Greenland, for God's sake. It's now a glacier. All right? Okay? I mean, this is Greenland down here. The Vikings used to farm this. Right? If you go back even further, you'll see we're way down here. The medieval warming period here, this was, by the way, the little ice age that recently occurred. We're basically rebounding from the little ice age. Back in this Holocene maximum, we're nowhere near a maximum temperature. So things have been a lot hotter, and there were no SUVs back then. There were no coal-burning power plants, and there was no Al Gore hyping it up. Okay? Things have been a lot hotter. If you go back even further, you'll see there's been a lot more peaks a lot much higher than where we are today. There weren't any SUVs back then. Okay? And, believe it or not, the Arctic used to be tropical. The Arctic zone used to be as warm as Florida. Okay?
Where'd all the hot air come from without rolling around there?
That's right. His jet's been adding global warming CO2.
It was Ted Kennedy.
But as you can see, when they sit there and they cause all this hype about the temperatures being at record levels, no way. This is their own data. Okay? And I guarantee you, we're a lot cooler than it was when the Arctic was as warm as Florida. Okay? There's a scientific consensus. Well, if there was a scientific consensus, the Nobel Prize people don't know it. How many Nobel Prize have been given for global warming? 0. And I'm willing to bet after you see this data, there's never going to be. Consensus is a complete 180 degrees from where it was just 30 years ago. What's the most ironic thing is if you go see Al Gore's movie, I mean, one of the big things behind global warming is this consensus. He mocks the consensus twice. In his opening scene, he mocks the consensus because when he was a kid, there was a consensus that the continents were never joined. So he says, how stupid could they be? And then he mocks the consensus that at one time, tobacco was supposed to be good for you. Okay, so these scientists can be way wrong. Not even close. And we're going to get to a little bit more of that here in a minute.
Right there right now.
And just think in your own lifetime. You know, just when I was a kid, there's overpopulation. The population bomb book was published. The Silent Spring book. You know, we were supposed to have every square inch of land was supposed to be covered by a human being by this time. Okay, that was a bunch of bull. I remember as a kid once again, we were going to run out of oil in 10 years. I was scared to death. We went from oil shortage to a glut overnight. Coming ice age, once again we had a coming ice age, that was wrong. The earth was flat, that was wrong. Disconnected continents, that was wrong. Man can't fly, that was wrong. So scientific consensus hasn't exactly proven to be the best thing. And it certainly is not going to prove it if you have bad data. Okay? Well, the bottom line is there is no scientific consensus. Okay? In 1998, 17,000 scientists. You know, the one I always hear is this survey of 5,000 scientists say global warming is occurring. Well, we got 17,000 on our side. 17,000 scientists, 6 of whom are Nobel Prize laureates, signed the Oregon petition, which declared, in part, there is no convincing scientific evidence that human release of greenhouse gases is causing, or will, in the foreseeable future, cause catastrophic heating of the Earth's atmosphere and disruption of Earth's climate. 17,000 of them. Okay? In 1999, over 10,000 of the world's most renowned climatologists, astrophysicists, meteorologists signed an open letter by Frederick Seitz, National Academy of Sciences past president, that states in part, the Kyoto Accord is based upon flawed ideas. Okay? Down here, another one. Richard Lasden, Massachusetts, wrote this piece that basically says the same thing, that they used global warming to bludgeon political opponents and propagandize uninformed citizens. And I believe that, because that's when you see this data, they're certainly not there giving you a critical analysis of the data. They're telling you the conclusions that they've already reached. Once again, if you've got the thing, here's just more of it. Once again, you can go and just click on any one of these, and it'll take you right to that report so you can see where the data comes from. This one I thought was kind of interesting. Scientists reading the leaves to predict violent weather. All right? What I liked about this one was, has anyone ever done like a scientific project where you're using multivariable modeling, multivariable linear regression or anything like that? When you go out there, you collect data on 10 or 15 different things and you run a model on it. Well, when you do those things, I did a lot of that with my job. I used to try to model the S&P 500. Okay? And I learned real quick, you can't model the S&P 500, which is relatively simple. There's no way in heck you can maybe model the atmosphere and things 100 years down the road. Well, that's what this guy points out. He goes out there, and meteorologist Edward Lorenz set up his computer to model the weather in 1960. He had no idea what a complex problem he was taking on. After a while, he realized that any small change in the starting condition of his program had a huge impact on the outcome of his experiments. His conclusion after he realized these models are so sensitive and you can't really control them and they're not very good, predicting weather with pinpoint accuracy will never be possible. So this is a guy who actually tried to model it himself. He started to realize the complexity that goes into it, and he said, this is a bunch of joke. We're never going to be able to do it. All right? Okay. Al Gore. The last little theory that we had. Al Gore is not running for president. Okay? His movie, if you like this kind of stuff, is a propaganda masterpiece. He'll go through those charts that we just tore apart. He'll breeze over. He'll give you his conclusion. And he'll never mention the data from Mauna Loa. He'll never mention the core of Samuel Class. He just tells you what he wants you to believe. All right? He replaces, and when he goes through there, he weaves the story that makes you think, without saying it, I should vote for Al. Okay? He replaces terrorism as our greatest threat. Global warming, you should fear. Osama bin Laden, no big deal. Okay? But the movie is boring. Well, boring as Al Gore. I mean, it was boring. But it is definitely a propaganda masterpiece. Once again, if you have the CD, go click on this. It's a pretty good little YouTube video of Al Gore and his army of penguins. It's pretty good. Here's the big problem. Even if you buy everything they say, man doesn't produce CO2 in any sizable quantities. This is their own chart. Once again, this probably came from Greenpeace. The oceans produce 100 to 115 billion tons of CO2. B with a B, a billion with a B. 100 to 115. The variation alone is 3 times what man produces. Man produces 5.3, a drop in the bucket, so to speak. More importantly, trees breathing. I always say this, people say, trees don't breathe. Yeah, they do. Trees breathing produce 10 times as much CO2 as man does. Right? So when you're talking about the scale, man just doesn't produce that much. It may make the news, may get people hyped up.
So you're saying once stop global warming, we need to drain the oceans and burn down the forests?
You got it. If you want, exactly. I got a funny story about that. We were down, when we went to the Al Gore movie, one of the pieces later on that comes up is methane. And we made a comment about how methane is increasing also. And this one woman that was Harvey Wasserman's girlfriend points out, well, what we're going to do is we got to stop eating meat. Right? So I go, well, what do you want us to do? Kill all the cows? And she goes, well, after we eat them, I go, well, actually, what creates methane are decomposing trees from termites and wetlands. So what we could do is cut down all the forests and drain the wetlands. She turned white as a ghost. She's like, that's not an option. More importantly, though, bottom line is that's the carbon cycle. It's kind of interesting to look at. More importantly is, no matter what we do, Mother Nature has a balance of CO2 in the atmosphere. The oceans are a huge buffer of CO2. And it's determined not by man, but by nature. It's called Davis's law. And anyone who's ever had a pop bottle knows that if you chill it, you can unscrew it, not much pops up. You put that pop bottle on a burner, it explodes, right? Because all that CO2 is driven out. And what the environmentalists don't seem to understand is the diffusion of a gas, the amount of gas that the water will hold, decreases with an increase in temperature. So Mother Nature herself increases atmospheric CO2 as temperatures increase by the sun. Okay? So let's just assume we do we stop producing CO2. Mother Nature has a balance, a partial pressure of atmospheric CO2 that she's going to balance for a given temperature. So if we pull CO2 out, she just pumps more up there. It's a huge buffer. So there's really nothing man can do about temperature anyways because Mother Nature controls it. And once again, for some reason, she likes more CO2, not less. Otherwise, the oceans would absorb CO2 with an increase in temperature. It doesn't. It releases it. Okay, man produces only 5 to 7% of CO2. Mother Nature produces the vast majority of atmospheric CO2. Mother Nature increases CO2 with an increase in temperature, decomposition, and respiration. So as the Earth warms, that's why CO2 increases after temperature, because you have to first warm the Earth. Things grow, they decompose, they respire. That's why CO2 follows temperature, it doesn't lead it. And once again, the oceans are the buffer. So if we pump too much CO2 in the atmosphere, the oceans absorb it. If we pull it out, the oceans will expire. Okay? Seeing the forest through the trees. I use this one because when you look at that global cycle, the carbon cycle, if you're trying to model something, you look for significant variables. If man's producing 5% of it, wouldn't you really study the 95%? I mean, don't you think it's more likely that something with the 95% is changing than huge changes of this 5%? I mean, this isn't logical that you sit there and you think, I'm going to go study global warming, man's doing it. When Mother Nature creates 95% of atmospheric CO2. So you would think they'd look at nature first, right? They don't. Here's a book, Seeing the Forest Through the Trees. Wildfires may be linked to global warming. Now, if you go out there and you want to see where CO2 comes from, watch what happens when they burn down 6 million acres of Yellowstone. Each one of those trees is an SUV of CO2 being pumped in the atmosphere. Mother Nature produces a heck of a lot of CO2, far more than man ever does. Matter of fact, one volcano alone will produce the entire amount of the industrial age of CO2. Okay? 10-year average of forest fires, basically 47,000 fires a year, 2.5 million acres, and that's just in the U.S. alone. That's a lot of CO2. But what I found interesting was, this is a quote from a Nature article. Surprisingly, the extent of recent changes has never been systematically documented. They don't even look. It's like they're so blinded by trying to prove man's doing it, they don't even bother to take a look. Well, maybe Mother Nature has a bit to do with this. And they even point out, surprisingly, we never looked at this before. It's like, who's running the show? Okay? Well, here's another thing. This is the one that I find most interesting. Or one of the most interesting is, if you're running a study, let's say on a cancer drug, and you have 10 people and 2 of them die, would you ever, when you produce your results, just say, let's just eliminate those 2 that died from the data sample, and we'll produce a study on those remaining ones? Does that make sense? Would the FDA ever buy that? If the FDA found out that you were just removing everyone that dies from your data sample, okay, you're going to be thrown in jail, okay? You do that kind of stuff in the real world, you go to jail, right? That's fraud. Well, what do they do in the global warming science? Here's what causes global warming. These are the global warming gases. And I bet you don't even know this. Water vapor is by far the most significant greenhouse gas. Does anyone know that? No. It's approximately 95% of all greenhouse gases is water vapor. Okay? Here's good old CO2 down here at about 5%. So how do they reach this conclusion? CO2 is the most significant greenhouse gas. That's what I've been told. That's what Al Gore told me. How do they reach that conclusion? Well, you just yank water vapor out of the data set and voila! CO2 becomes the most significant. That's not a joke. CO2, methane, NO2, miscellaneous gases, missing water vapor. Okay? So you just pull it out. Voila, you're right. You do this kind of stuff, you can prove anything. Right? I mean,
now, why would they do that? That's what the big question is.
Why would they do that?
Why would they do that?
Now, if you include all greenhouse gases, and this is why it's such a joke that man caused it, man produces 0.28% of all global warming gases. 0.28%. We're losing sleep over 0.28%. Don't you think they'd look at the other 99% plus that might be causing global warming? Okay? It's a joke, in my mind. Right? But it does show you ways that you can really lie with numbers, and if the people don't understand what you're doing, you can get them to buy anything. I mean, Al Gore's got a whole movie based on this, and he would never show you this chart.
So why are they pushing this kind of propaganda?
We'll get to that, George. We cover all bases here.
Those are the why questions.
Okay?
I know.
The other thing is, anytime you do a scientific study, you just don't get to run out and say, the Earth is round, right? And everyone buys into it. There's a tyranny of status quo. You have to prove the significance beyond like a 95 percentile. You ever hear them use those terms? We're certain within the 95 percentile that this is an accurate thing, right? You don't get to just simply create a new theory and say, okay, we're going with this one. What you have to do is, if it occurred before, you have to disprove that what caused it before didn't happen this time, right? Well, as I showed earlier, every time you had a cycle before, what did they say? The sun caused it, right? Why is this time any different? Nobody's ruled out the sun yet, and in fact, we showed that the temperature was decreasing. You don't see Al Gore saying, well, by the way, we ruled out the sun pretty well. No, they just come out and said, man caused it, right? But no one's disproven what caused it before, which is typically good science. It's called the tyranny of status quo, okay? They're also saying this time is different. No, it's not. At least I haven't been proving it, okay? Sun caused previous cycle. No reason to think it's any different this time. The sun, by the way, is the hottest in 1,000 years. Now, don't you think that if the sun is the hottest it's been in 1,000 years, don't you think it might have an impact here on the Earth, too? I mean, what are they thinking? Well, the sun's awfully hot, but that can't be the cause. Man, that SUV over there. So, Peter, go ahead.
No.
Okay? And once again, this stuff is known. I mean, these aren't my reports. The truth about global warming, it's the sun to blame. It should say it's the sun, stupid. Okay? Scientists blame sun for global warming. No, duh. You go out on the porch, you watch the sun come up, it gets warm, it goes down, it gets cool. Why is that so hard to believe? Okay? I mean, who would think that SUV is causing it? Okay? Once again, this isn't my data. Someone's already done it. They've gone out there and said, wait a minute. What's warming the Earth? It's solar activity. Here's basically a measurement of the solar output. Here's a measure of the temperature. Doesn't that look like it ties pretty well together? High correlation. Here's the predict. Let me go back. That's one bug we have to work out of this presentation. Okay? Over here you have predicted global warming. Here's actual, so their model is basically pretty bad. But once again, it's come from the Astrophysical Journal and the Mars Institute. Carbon dioxide, temperature difference are basically saying it's solar activity, not carbon dioxide. And once again, their models are way wrong. Okay? Now, once again, a normal scientist would go, well, let's say, if it's the sun, how can I prove it's the sun? Well, you'd look at other things the sun would be impacted that wouldn't be impacted by man, like Mars, the solar system. Because if the sun's increasing in temperature, the other planets would be warming also, right? That's, to me, good science. So I'd sit there and say, if the sun's causing it, are the other planets warming? Well, you got it. Mars is warming too. So you're telling me man is causing global warming here on Earth. What's causing it on Mars? Okay? That's logic to me. Okay? Martian planets shrinking dramatically. Their polarized caps are melting, ours are thickening. Right? But once again,
Sheila Jackson Lee knows we got that data from when we landed on Mars.
yeah.
Bob, it sounds very simple the way you describe it. The sun doesn't. But what about the protecting ozone layer that they have found has huge holes in it, which are, the ozone layer is a protective layer that protects from the UV rays, right?
Yes.
But those so-called holes that have been created by man's activity, I guess, have become increasingly larger, and there's been a lot of, I guess, science that proves all of that. So where does that fit into your picture?
Well, I've never heard the ozone hole directly tied to global warming, but I do know one thing.
Why do we wear all the sunscreen, you know, to protect us?
Well, the theory is that chlorofluorocarbons increasing in the atmosphere has led to a larger ozone hole. That's the theory, right? CFCs led to a higher ozone hole, right? More sunlight's come through, right? The problem is, one, they don't know what a big ozone hole is because the first measurements came about 1950-something. Two, we banned ozone, or CFCs, back in 1980, and the ozone hole is today reaching record highs. So even after we banned it 20 years later, the ozone hole is reaching new highs. So more than likely, it's a natural cause of the ozone hole, which, by the way, is probably due to the sun. Because what's causing the ozone to begin with anyways is the solar energy. So it's kind of logical to think that if the sun's hitting a record high, solar winds are hitting a record high, your ozone hole is probably going to be the record high. And that's what I would bet. But I've never heard ozone hole tied into global warming.
Have any of the global warming scientists that say it's anthropogenic causes, do they say that the ozone has anything to do?
I have not heard. I've heard the ozone hole tied to CFCs. I've never heard it tied to global warming. But
even they don't say it.
Yeah, I've never heard. If you can find that, Elgar, I'd like to know it. But and bottom line is, we banned CFCs a long time ago, and the ozone hole is hitting records. So if anything, banning the CFCs may have caused the ozone to get bigger. So, but because typically you would expect them to have decreased, but they didn't. Here's the other thing that I find interesting, and I love the way that they kind of skirt around the issues. CO2 highest in 650,000 years. Well, we know that's not true. But more importantly, they kind of overlook this. Methane in the atmosphere is now higher. Okay? So I buy, okay, even if I buy the fact that man.
Welcome back to Open Line at WOSU 820. This hour we'll talk about the importance of nature and the fate of our planet, about our interdependence with the plants and animals of the earth and the earth itself. My guest, environmentalist David Suzuki, told a Canadian broadcast audience in 1988 that the basic life support systems of our planet were being destroyed at an alarming rate and on a massive scale. So 16 years later, where do we stand now? Is Earth, to coin a phrase, in the balance? Are we doing a better job of helping our planet flourish? My guest is a leading environmentalist and geneticist who has received consistently high acclaim for his ability to explain the complexities of science in a compelling and easily understood way. You've seen David Suzuki's public television series, The Secret of Life, on WOSU TV 34, and his series, The Brain, on the Discovery Channel. He's the author of more than 40 books, including The Sacred Balance, A Tree, and Good News for a Change. His new book is David Suzuki, The Autobiography. Welcome back from the San Francisco Bay Area this morning. David Suzuki, good to have you here.
Good to be here.
That 1988 CBC radio series called It's a Matter of Survival,
yes.
You interviewed, you say, 150 scientists and experts, very life support systems of the planet destroyed at a horrifying rate and on a grand scale. Well, how are we doing now, 16 years later?
Well, I mean, we're continuing on the same path. We are undermining the life support systems, and I don't know if you've seen what's come out in the last couple of weeks, the report, the study, the 4-year study on the state of the ocean's fishes.
Yes.
And it's absolutely catastrophic. They're now predicting that every single edible fish that we use will have collapsed by 2048. There was a report that came out 3 weeks ago that looked at human predation. That is, we cut trees down and we take fish and we put carbon dioxide into the air. And if all of human activity, what we take out of our environment, can be replaced by nature in a year, if what we take in a year is replaced by nature in a year, then presumably we could do it forever. That's sustainability. But what they find is that it takes 1 1/3 year for nature to replace what we take out in a year. And this is deficit spending. We're using up our natural resources. And we've been doing this for over 20 years now. That is taking more in a year than nature can reproduce. And by 2050, at the rate we're going, they say it will take 2 planets to provide us with what we demand. So obviously we're just using up the natural capital of the earth. And we call it economic progress. I don't get it. We're polluting the atmosphere, so the climate is changing. We're depleting the oceans. We're destroying the forests. We're polluting the air, water, and soil. And we all do this in the name of economic growth.
And, of course, just on a practical level, it's going to cost us greatly on the economic level.
Oh, I mean, there was a report that came out from an economist, Sir Nicholas Stern, in Britain, that looked at the cost of doing or not doing anything about climate change. And what he says is that it will cost us, if we don't do anything about climate change, it's going to cost us of the order of $7 trillion to try to deal with the consequences of that. He says it will be more expensive to deal with the effects of climate change than the cost of World War I and World War II put together. And yet you have a country, the biggest polluter of the atmosphere in the world, the United States, that is refusing to even sign the Kyoto Protocol, which is the attempt to begin to cap our emissions and bring it down.
Well, you talk about the general scientific illiteracy of many people. And, in fact, the Canadian Parliament, you said, when people have been tested in the Parliament, members of the Parliament, they don't know a great deal about science. Is it illiteracy? Or do people of the various nations, the governments, understand what's going on?
Well, that's a very, very interesting question, because Britain has certainly taken the threat of global warming very, very seriously. They have set a target of over an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2040. And it was Britain that asked this economist, Sir Nicholas Stern, to examine the economic costs of climate change. And I think that they've taken it very seriously. So has France and so have Germany, because they have a long tradition of science. Science, you think of England, you think of Charles Darwin, you think of Sir Isaac Newton, you think of some of the greatest scientists. Were English. It's a part of their culture. And I don't understand why the United States, this year, the United States won every single science Nobel Prize. Science, the United States is a leading country in the area of science, and yet you have the president, who has been advised by the National Academy of Sciences, the leading scientist in the United States, saying that global warming is a far greater threat to American stability and survival than terrorism, that you've got to do something immediately, and yet he's even denying that climate change is real. What's going on? I don't get it. The indication in Canada, when we did this is back in the 1970s, was that when we looked at members of parliament in Ottawa, over 70% of them came from business and they came from law. That was their background. When we gave 50 members of parliament a simple test for their comprehension of science and technology, it was business people and lawyers who scored absolutely rock bottom. So what does that mean? It means that we elect people to office who are scientifically illiterate, and they're going to have to make decisions about what we do about global warming, what we do about toxic pollution, what we do about the depleted ocean reserves, what we do about deforestation, about stem cell research, about cloning. How can you make informed, thoughtful decisions if you're scientifically illiterate? So this is the problem we face, is that our elected representatives are a reflection of the general population. If the population is scientifically illiterate, we can't make really informed decisions.
Why do you think the general population in the United States and Canada is scientifically illiterate?
Because we are failing to make science a fundamental part of our educational system. We talk about the 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic. Well, science should be one of the most fundamental things that we learn, because science is the most powerful force that shapes our lives today. Science, when applied by industry, medicine, and the military, have reverberations that rattle through our lives. You know, when I was born in 1936, when I was a child, there were no computers, there were no jet planes, there were no satellites, there were no transistors, there were no Xerox, oral contraceptives, organ transplants. I mean, you think of the way that our lives have been changed in the last 65, 70 years by science. Our lives in society have been transformed beyond recognition. Well, surely as we go our way into the 21st century, we've got to be scientifically literate so that we can avoid the terrible problems that result from the application of science and technology.
As you point out, we generally embrace technology because they do things for us that are very practical,
yes,
but we don't think of the side effects. We don't plan for them.
Exactly. And we've got lessons here that should teach us to be more careful. I mean, Rachel Carson in 1962 wrote Silent Spring, and, you know, when DDT was found to kill insects, we thought it was the greatest thing ever going. The man who discovered it won a Nobel Prize in 1948. We thought DDT was great. When Rachel Carson came out with her book, the chemical industry just attacked her as an old maid, hysterical, didn't have the scientific credibility, and of course she was right. And DDT ought to be a warning to us that technology is very powerful, but there are unexpected effects, and we've got to be more careful. CFC is the same thing, and I'm sure the same thing is going to happen with genetically modified organisms.
Well, yes, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, if generally the population in North America is not literate scientifically, if it is because we do not educate in schools, and therefore we elect people who themselves are scientifically illiterate and expect them to deal with these technological and environmental changes, that's not a very optimistic scenario. Huh?
It's a very frightening scenario, because what happens with politicians? They make decisions then that are based on political considerations, and I use this in the most pejorative way. It's about power politics and who has access to our politicians, especially in the United States, a tremendous amount of lobbying that goes on. Well, this is the system that we've got. If the people that pay for people to run for office get their candidates elected, they have direct access to those politicians. If I give someone $100,000 to run for office and he's elected, and I call him after he's elected, don't you think he's going to invite me into his office right away? Mm-hmm. And the lobbying power in the United States is immense. And we're basing our decisions not on informed, thoughtful consideration.
So maybe, given that, in terms of our Earth's environment, things are going to have to get a great deal worse before they get it all better.
Well, I can't imagine things getting worse. I don't know what it's going to take. When 20% of our children are growing up with asthma, that ought to tell us something about the air quality that we've got. When 1 out of 8 women is going to develop breast cancer, that's not genetic, that's environmental. What do we think? You know, breasts are made of fatty tissue, and a lot of chemicals like DDT and dioxin and dieldrin and PCBs, they're lipophilic. They like to go to fatty tissue, and that's why the breasts of women have become like the canaries in the coal mine. They're telling us something's wrong in our environment. What is it going to take when our oceans are collapsing, the climate is warming up? What is it going to take for us to pay attention? I don't get it.
I guess that's a rhetorical question. What is it going
It
to
is.
take? Because I don't know the answer to that. Do you?
It's because we don't pay attention to scientists. For scientists have been telling us over and over again, you know, and I as a biologist, I think of our evolutionary history. Human beings arose on this planet 150,000 years ago in Africa. And when you think of the environment back then, human beings did not look very impressive. I mean, we were this two-legged, hairless ape surrounded by countless mammals of all kinds. Well, you know, there weren't many of us. We weren't very big or fast or strong. We were a very unprepossessing creature. We've had a remarkable history. How the heck did that two-legged ape take over the planet? Well, of course, the secret of our survival was a brain, and that brain gave us tremendous inventive ability, and the human brain invented this idea called the future. You know, the future doesn't exist. The only thing that exists is now. But because the human brain invented the idea of a future, we are the only animal that realized we can affect the future by what we do today. If we look ahead, see where the dangers are, see where the opportunities lie, then we can choose a path into the future that will give us a greater chance for survival. So foresight was a very human characteristic that gave us the advantage, and it got us to where we are today. And today we have all of the predictive ability of scientists and computers and engineers and telecommunications. And we need that foresight more than ever today. You know, for over 20 years, scientists in the United States were telling us that New Orleans was a disaster waiting to happen. When you build a city in the heart of hurricane country and half of the city is below sea level, you're asking for trouble. And they said eventually there's going to be a Force 5 hurricane hit New Orleans, and if you want to avoid a catastrophe, this is what you've got to do. And nobody did anything, and so guess what? The future happened, and we didn't pay attention, and Katrina happened, and disaster. So even though we're very sophisticated today, we need to use foresight more than ever. And our scientists have been telling us we're on a deadly path. And now we say, oh, but it'll destroy the economy. Oh, we can't do that. We're going to have to go out of business if we do that. So we're failing to pay attention to what scientists say. And we're failing to use the only survival strategy that got us to where we are now, the ability to look ahead.
David, in your new book, David Suzuki, the autobiography, you say you'd like to provide an action component. So for our listeners, what's the action component here? Here's the problem, and we're not using our foresight. What can we do?
Well, a lot of people, of course, they know that we're in trouble. They look around, they can see the changes, and they know something's wrong. And so they come to me all the time, and they say, well, what can I do? I'm insignificant. I'm one person out of 6.7 billion people. What difference does it make what I do? And they want to do something that will have an effect. So my foundation, the David Suzuki Foundation, got together with the Union of Concerned Scientists, this organization in the United States, and we said, where do individual people have the greatest impact on nature or the environment? And it was right away we realized it's what we eat, how we move, transportation, and where we live. So food, transportation, and housing is where we focused on, and we came up with a list of the 10 most effective things that every one of us can do. Now, I have to admit, when they came to me with the list the first time, I threw it on the floor. I said, come on, get serious. This is too easy. But then they showed me the scientific reasoning behind each of the suggestions, and I'm now convinced these are the 10 most effective things we can do. And they're very simple. If you eat meat, give up meat 1 day a week. You know, if you're a Catholic, you know that's the way it used to be all the time. If you take a car to work or school or play, leave the car at home 1 day a week. we say try to make your house more energy efficient so you reduce your energy bill by 10%. Well, you're going to make money then. When you're buying a new household appliance, a hot water tank, a refrigerator, an electric kettle, look at the energy guide that tells you how energy efficient that is, and get the most energy efficient appliance you can get. They're very practical, simple things, but they if many of us do it, we can have a real impact. We've got 300,000 Canadians who have now signed up and have said, I'm going to try to do at least 3 of these 10 things in the coming year.
And among the other 10 of the Nature Challenge, buy locally grown and produced food.
Yes.
Choose a fuel efficient.
Don't use pesticides around the house. Mm-hmm. And one of the most important things is to apply your democratic principles. Write politicians, phone them, go to all candidates' meetings and raise environmental issues. Each of us can have an impact, or has an impact, but we need leadership at the political level as well, because politicians have to show leadership. They have to begin to pass laws that encourage corporations to do the right things. We need leadership at that level, and we as voters have to begin to use that responsibility.
So if sufficient numbers of us did all these 10 things, plus contacting our representatives and would that make a big difference?
Of course. Mm-hmm. Could have a huge impact. And, I remind people that Margaret Mead said, never despair that a group of dedicated, informed individuals can make a difference. In fact, that's the only way change has come about. And I agree with her. It's got to start at the level of the grassroots, and we've got to show by what we want that we make change happen. Mm-hmm. And in 1988, I interviewed a young American senator for a radio series, and he sent shivers up my back. I had never met a politician that understood the environmental problems as deeply as he did. And at the end, and it was Al Gore, by the way. He was a senator from Tennessee at that time. And at the end of my interview, I put down my microphone. I said, Senator, how can journalists like me help politicians like you? And he said, don't look to politicians like me. He said, if you want to bring about change, you've got to convince the public there's a problem. Show them that there are things that can be done. Show them there are alternatives. And get them to care enough so they demand that change be made. He said, when that happens, every politician will jump on the bandwagon. And I'm absolutely convinced he was right, and that's what's got to be done. We at the grassroots have to begin to see what the situation is, look at the alternatives, and demand that our so-called leaders in politics and business begin to do the right things.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And David, these 10 points of the Nature Challenge, they're in your new book, David Suzuki, The Autobiography. Are they also accessible online through the...
Yes, you can find them at davidsuzuki.org. And right on the first page, there's the Nature Challenge. We have a Nature Challenge for business, Nature Challenge for schools, Nature Challenge for kids. We're trying to get as many people to sign up as possible, because then if we get 1 million Canadians signed up, I'm absolutely sure I'll be able to take that to any politician and say, look, we've got 1 million Canadians already doing something. Will you sign? And every one of them will, as Al Gore told us. They'll jump on the bandwagon. You can find it also on the Union of Concerned website. I don't know what the actual name is, but
Union of Concerned Scientists.
You can find it. Yeah.
I think UCS.org. Yes,
yeah. They call it something else. It's not the Nature Challenge, but they have the list of those 10 things as well.
We're talking with biologist and environmentalist David Suzuki. You've seen his public television series, The Secret of Life, his series, The Brain, on the Discovery Channel, his new book, David Suzuki, The Autobiography. We're at 614-292-8513. Call us. Thanks for patiently waiting here as we get through a great deal of important material. And now let's go to you. Matt is on the line. Hi, Matt.
Hi. Every week I throw away about 5 pounds of newspaper, which, as far as I know, and I wonder if you could clear this up, is torn out of the Canadian arboreal forest, which we are chopping down at an unreproducible rate. That really upsets me. I can't help but think that number 11 on your list should be stop buying newspapers and forbid the endless use of these flyers, especially around Christmas time, and everybody throws them away.
Yeah.
Yet they must do something, otherwise manufacturers and stores wouldn't pay to put them in. But the waste is appalling, and the arboreal forest is finite and probably has other things of a regulatory, climate regulatory function we simply can't afford to throw away.
David, tell us about that.
Well, I think your listeners raised a really important point, and that is that all things like newspapers, and what is really shocking to me is a lot of our temperate old-growth rainforest as well as boreal forest is going to make toilet paper. Do we insist on wiping our bottoms with virgin forest? I mean, this is crazy. We ought to have legislation that demands that paper, especially like newspapers and toilet paper and all kinds of things, is made of post-consumer recycled material. And we've got to look at our own habits. Toilet paper, there's all kinds of recycled toilet paper that's available. We ought to be demanding of our newspapers that they use post-consumer recycled material. And we ought to give incentives that allow corporations to get an advantage by using recycled material like this. But I think Matt, you also raise a secondary issue, which is the amount of packaging. My family many years ago decided that we had to reduce our garbage stream, and this was difficult for a few months, but this is a family of 4, we got our garbage reduced to less than 1 green bag of garbage a month. And I'm ashamed to say that about over half of that garbage that we do put out each month is still plastic that can't be recycled. And huge amounts of that plastic comes in packaging. In Germany, they have laws that say that the businesses cannot make packaging unless it's recycled or reused. And so we just need legislation that demands that this stuff is being recycled. And, it's all possible, but we need leadership on the part of government.
And as you suggest, we're probably not going to get that leadership unless we demand it. Is that right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Environmentalist David Suzuki with us, joining us from the San Francisco Bay Area this morning. His new book, David Suzuki, The Autobiography. And we're at 614-292-8513. David, before we go back to our next caller, we were talking about newspapers, and I told you I got a certain newspaper at home, and I thought, well, I can recycle that. But you said do more than recycle. You say write the newspaper and ask them what kind of paper they're printing on, huh? And David, yes, do we have you here?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Now we're fine, yes.
Okay. Well, the consumer can certainly exert pressure on the companies, and what you do is you complain, or you write to them, and get as many people to do that. That's how you bring the fact of the need for this approach to their attention.
Mm-hmm. Do you think any of the major newspapers that you know of in Canada or the United States are actually taking action here?
In fact, there were several years ago, one of the newspaper chains announced that they were going to use recycled newsprint, and I haven't followed up on that. But certainly, in 1988, when the peak of public concern over the environment happened, there were a lot of announcements like that and changes. But of course, during the Reagan years, everything slipped down and the environment passed out. But there were attempts in newspapers to do that. I might mention, by the way, now that I've said that the peak was in 1988, I want to remind your listeners that in 1988, a man ran for president of the United States, and he said, if you elect me, I'll be an environmental president. His name was George H.W. Bush. And as soon as he was elected, he showed that promises made during campaigns don't mean a bloody thing. But that was a reflection of the fact that the public in 1988 was concerned enough to make the environment the number one issue of the time, and that's what we've got to do again today. It's coming very strongly with climate change. I hope with the Stern report on the economic costs of climate change, and with the report on the depletion of the oceans.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's go back to our callers here with Bill. Hi, Bill.
How are you doing?
Good.
You're talking about this sustainability of things. Some of it, I think, is probably planned to be unsustainable. I don't know if you or your guest, either one, are aware. There was deal, I think the deal got put on hold somehow between Monsanto and a company called Delta Pineland. Recently, they had come up with something called Terminator seeds.
Yes.
You're aware of that?
Yes.
Okay. Now that kind of stuff has to be put a stop to. The whole thing is it's about money and politics. It has nothing to do with the companies solely. A lot of it ties into the globalization.
Yeah.
That's what this whole thing is about.
No, that you're absolutely right. Terminator seeds are the attempt to create plants that have a built-in gene that causes them to be sterile, so that you will ultimately become totally dependent on buying your seeds every year from the company that produces those seeds. But of course, the great fear, and I think an absolutely valid fear, is that once those seeds are grown out in the open, nature will find all kinds of ways to go around what we have designed so cleverly.
And everything on the planet becomes sterile.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Monsanto promised us that when they had their Roundup Ready crops, that no, don't worry, it won't spread. You just have to put a little buffer zone around the fields and everything will be fine. Well, it turns out that they can spread very rapidly into the neighboring weeds, and that is just a lot of nonsense. So, yes, Monsanto, by the way, that the company that led the charge against Rachel Carson in 1962 was Monsanto. They haven't changed a damn bit in the 40-some-odd years since then. And the corporate agenda is a very, very destructive agenda. And all that's about is maximizing profit in the shortest length of time. It's got nothing to do with improving lives for human beings or protecting nature.
Bill, thanks for your call today. We're here with Mike. Hi, Mike.
Hi, I really appreciate the fabulous focus that Dr. Suzuki is making on education. That is obviously a lot has to go on, but I'm not hearing about two major stumbling blocks in educating the public about science, and that's that the public really doesn't understand that science is done by consensus, and that science has been politicized. Both the right and the left are guilty of this. If you don't like the science, you go off, make yourself a think tank, and come up with your own science. Can I hear something about that?
Yes.
Well, you're absolutely right about that. Let me just back up a bit. I sat for 4 years in Canada on this. We have an organization called the Science Council of Canada that's supposed to look at the big picture for science and society. We looked at education in Canada. Now, in Canada, education.
Hi, I really appreciate the fabulous focus that Dr. Suzuki is making on education. That is obviously a lot has to go on, but I'm not hearing about two major stumbling blocks in educating the public about science, and that's that the public really doesn't understand that science is done by consensus, and that science has been politicized. Both the right and the left are guilty of this. If you don't like the science, you go off, make yourself a think tank, and come up with your own science. Can I hear something about that?
Yes.
Well, you're absolutely right about that. Let me just back up a bit. I sat for 4 years in Canada on this. We have an organization called the Science Council of Canada that's supposed to look at the big picture for science and society. We looked at education in Canada. Now, in Canada, education is a provincial affair, and I'm sure it's the same in the United States. It's a state affair. And so for a federal organization to look at science education in Canada, it ruffled a lot of feathers because people said, hey, you're coming into our turf now. But in fact, the educators welcomed this overview, and what we came up with after 4 years was every school child should have 1 hour of science education from kindergarten to grade 12 every school day of the year. And we showed that it could be done. It wouldn't be economically disastrous, but nothing ever came of it. And that's the target that we need, is for science to be a part of every school child's education from kindergarten through grade 12. That's not That's not happening. What is happening, though, is that we don't look to science as the most credible way of describing the state of the world. We just, corporations see science as a threat, and so they have set up these right-wing think tanks. The fossil fuel industry has set up a group that is fighting against the scientific evidence on global warming. And so the public is left being very, very confused about what's going on. And I, as someone in the media, have seen, when we have discussed the issue of global warming, well, we put somebody on, the scientist on, who says, yes, global warming's happening, we've got to do something right away. And then in the name of balance, we then put someone on who says, no, there's no evidence that it's going on. And to the public, it seems as if it's still a controversy. The scientists haven't figured it out yet. But the reality is 99% of the climatologists are on side saying global warming's happening, we got to do something. A handful of scientists, most of them paid by the fossil fuel industry, are saying no. And yet the media portray it as if it's 50-50.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay,
Thanks.
Thanks for your call. And that's a concern. I think, David, when we present, or when I present here on Open Line, this issue of global warming, I may present a skeptic now and then, but I make the point repeatedly that this is not an argument anymore. I mean, this is 99%, as you say, of climate scientists. Global warming, due in great measure to human activity, is a serious problem, right?
Yeah, I think what we should be doing more as journalists is saying, excuse me, but, we're going to put you on, Mr. Expert, but where are you getting your money?
Mm-hmm. Trace
the money. For years, the tobacco industry had its own scientists who said, no, there's no evidence that smoking causes cancer. And it was a very effective ploy. There's a very good group called, a website called DSmog Blog. DSmog Blog is all about tracking down the skeptics, the science skeptics, and showing where they're getting their money. And it's a very revealing website. And a lot of these guys are saying, we're going to sue the hell out of you. And the people at DSmog Blog are saying, bring it on, sue us. And we're going to dig into your files in order to counter you. And nobody has dared to sue them. It's a very good website that shows all of these skeptics, well, most of these skeptics are being paid by industry.
DSmog Blog. Some I think are very sincere, but you're right. Most are probably industry related. Some of my listeners seem to have been convinced by some of these industry think tanks that indeed it is the scientists who have a political agenda here. How would you respond to that?
I don't get it. I mean, scientists go and do their work. It's true that scientists try to do their work often where they see money. If there's government money or corporate money to do certain things, scientists will often go to get the grants to do that. But in fact, there have been a number of books written showing that the Bush administration has politicized science tremendously, altering scientific reports so that they are not as strong on issues like climate change. I don't get what the scientific agenda is.
Mm-hmm.
Right. The political agenda of scientists is. I'd have to see what the claims are.
All right. Let us go back to our calls here with Paul. Hi, Paul.
Good morning, Fred, David.
Hello.
David, you stole all my thunder.
Good.
I have very little
left
to say, except that the concept of an hour a day in primary school and middle school, etc. I mean, I can't think of a better way to approach this. I mean, I happened to grow up in a family that was scientifically literate. I don't mean that, we all turned out to be scientists, but, you could have a discussion about DNA and everybody knew roughly what you were talking about.
Exactly.
It was carried forth kind of haphazardly through school, which was private Catholic, but, and I think pretty rigorous, and I was terrible at some things. I mean, chemistry, for the love of God, I can't, I still can't figure that out. But I guess my point is that it's like reading, as you said, writing, arithmetic, all that kind of stuff. If you get kids, not just on paper. I mean, that's a good start if you're,
Yeah.
7 years old.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, I just think that we, somewhere around 6th grade or something, it seems to derail. Now, I don't know.
David, there's a feeling out there, I think, among the general populace that somehow science is more difficult to understand than our other intellectual pursuits.
That's right. And the other part that's terrible is that people have this idea, well, if you're no good in math, you'll never do science. Now, it is true, to be a scientist, you really need math. But math, for the vast majority of people, often becomes a block. Oh God, that math stuff. I'll never be any good at science. That's absolutely untrue. I mean, if you get excited about science and want to go into science, the math part will come, and it'll be a part of your training. But science is an activity, as our caller says. To me, a child who finds a pupa of a butterfly and then brings it into the classroom, and the children watch that pupa eventually open up and give rise to a butterfly, that is one of the most profound experiences you can have. And that sense of wonder and awe is at the very heart of what science is all about. Looking at nature and finding out how nature does things is at the heart of science. But too often we teach science as this cut and dried thing. This is an experiment. This is what you have to do, and it's boring, and it turns kids off. Right. We're not teaching science the right way. But I think the challenge is that education is a state matter, and what you get are, if you want to teach biology, the only way to teach biology is that evolution is a part of biology. And I can't believe in the United States the terrible battles that happen then. You've got to teach creationism or intelligent design. Creationism and intelligent design are not science. It just doesn't belong in biology. Evolution is a fact. It's not a theory. It's a fact. We see evolution going on. The only thing that is questionable is, how does evolution happen? How did life originate? Those are scientific questions. But the whole issue of creationism and intelligent design muddy the whole picture, and I think it's tragic because it's not science.
David, how would you convince someone who sincerely, I've met people who sincerely believe they've studied from the Discovery Institute, the publications on intelligent design, and they find them, from their point of view, rational, and they say, well, we do think this is a scientific approach. What would you say to somebody who sincerely believes that?
No, I mean, I don't engage in that discussion. It's a simple fact that, sure, there are a lot of biologists with PhDs who are fundamentalists and believe in the biblical version of science, but that is a very schizophrenic approach, because if you're going to be a scientist, you don't discuss that kind of religious dogma. They're just different ways of looking at the world. I have no quarrel with someone that says that God created the earth in 7 days and blah, 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 and all of that. That's fine. You can believe that, but don't come and have a discussion about science. That's a belief, and science is a belief system as well. But if you're going to be a scientist, you have to accept the tenets of that belief system.
Biologist and environmentalist David Suzuki joins us. You've seen his public television series, The Secret of Life, on the Discovery Channel, The Brain, his new book, David Suzuki, The Autobiography. Back to our callers here now. Dave is on the line. Hello, Dave.
Yeah, I'm all in favor of educating the public and putting forth knowledge that will help to give people a better idea of what is taking place environmentally. But I have a real issue with the fact, and you were mentioning the lumber, the logging industry, and I can go to at least 5 major universities who will attest to the fact that there is more timber available now, more trees, more lumber available, in spite of all the housing development that's taken place in this country and Canada over the last 30 years. There is more lumber available now than there was 60 years ago, and that's a documented fact. And to say that we're using up the lumber and wood is one of our few renewable resources, and to say that American management, manufacturing in general, is ignoring that fact, I think is to do at a great disservice. And
I
also, as far as the Kyoto agreements are concerned, one of the primary factors of not signing on was the fact that the United States has to take full and entire blame of this, quote, pollution that's taking place, and it's all right for China to go ahead in its industrial surging now to go ahead and pollute.
That's not what the Kyoto Protocol is.
Exempt from a lot of those restrictions.
That's not what the
If you're going to have to play the field, let everyone play it equally.
That's not what the Kyoto Protocol was at all. I was there at the Kyoto conferences. The United States tried very hard to monkey wrench that whole process. There were a lot of lobbying groups there, fossil fuel industry, trying to get it off the rails. The whole point about Kyoto was that the industrialized world had created a problem with their industrial growth, the burning of fossil fuels. We had filled up the atmosphere beyond the capacity of all of the green things to reabsorb carbon dioxide, and CO2 was accumulating as well as other greenhouse gases were accumulating in the atmosphere. Since the industrialized world had created the problem and continued to be the major contributors, the industrialized world said, we will cap our emissions and begin to bring them down a tiny, tiny way, 6% below 1990 levels by the year 2012. And at that time, when we had shown that we were going to cap emissions and bring them down, then by 2010, we would begin negotiations with the rest of the world, the developing world that was coming up. You know that China is going to pass the U.S. as the major polluter by about 2009, and they would be brought on board. But we have created the problem. It wasn't the United States alone that was going to be made to carry the can. The United States produced 22 to 25% of the greenhouse gases, the major emitter, but all the other industrialized countries, and they have all signed on, have said, yes, we've got a cap and begin to bring it down. But the whole idea was the countries that had created the problem would lead the way and show that we were going to cap. And if we don't meet these targets, why should China or India or Indonesia or Brazil pay any attention to the need to bring their emissions down? We had to lead the way because we had created the problem. So the people that keep saying, oh, well, it's not fair, the China and India aren't on line, fail to understand the reasoning behind the whole Kyoto process. Now, on the lumber point, the problem we face is that in Canada, I don't know how it is in the United States, in Canada we talk about sustainability of forests, and they are sustainable in principle, renewable. Why is it then that after all of the battles over old-growth logging, over 90% of all the trees cut in Canada are still from old-growth forests? They're not coming from second or third growth forests. And the problem is the forest industry talks about plantations as forests. A plantation is not a forest. So what we're doing is we're trashing forests and we're growing plantations. And that means that biodiversity is disappearing and we don't have the resilience that an old-growth forest does, because an old-growth forest is a community of organisms that are much of it is lost when you clear-cut and replace with plantations.
Caller, does that make sense to you, or what would you say?
Now, as far as clear-cutting, most of American industry right now, I mean, they're not stupid. This is a renewable resource that they want for generations to come. We're into the third forest right now, and there is still more timber, more logs, more lumber that's available than 60 years ago.
I'm asking you, why is it
as far as the Kyoto agreements, it's still, China has no environmental protection requirements that even come close to what the U.S. industry has to come close to. And for that reason alone, why shouldn't the same standards apply to China? Because they're spewing out and polluting more, but nobody's tracking it. Nobody's watching it. And day by day, they continue to pollute more and more, and yet that all goes unchecked. And then who gets the brunt of it is the United States.
David, thanks for your thoughts. Appreciate your call. And next on the line is George. Hello, George.
Yeah, good morning, Fred, and a great guest. I concur also that we need to put more emphasis in our educational system on science, primarily because that way our students and our young citizens as they grow up will not be subjective to scientifically motivated political propaganda. You know, just like, for instance, DDT. DDT's been suspended for a number of time, and malaria has made a huge comeback, so much so that the WHO, under the United Nations, talking about reintroducing the use of DDT. True or false?
Yeah.
True, that's exactly right. I'd like to ask your guest if he watched the Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth.
Sure.
Okay. You know, why is it in that movie that Al Gore's portrayal of global warming, and incidentally, just as a quick aside, 100 years ago in Albany, New York, they started keeping very intensive records of climatic temperatures, as you well know. The average then was 42.2 degrees, and today, 100 years later, in Albany, New York, same circumstances, 42.2. The bottom line here is in Al Gore's movie, not once did he mention solar activities and solar flares, solar cycles, as possibly the culprit behind a slight warming up that may or may not exist on the globe. I mean, how would your you know, we've got a local guy that's an internet skeptic around putting on some evaluations of the data, a lot of which was drawn from Al Gore's movie, that clearly shows that there's some bad science going on. You know, and just one last point, your guest says it's evil. It's just bad for corporations to finance private research, but no problem for universities to accept money confiscated by the government from these industries for government research that funds all kinds of activities, and they have, in fact, a vested interest in said research and those financial sources coming in. And finally, Kyoto Protocol, in my view, is just simply a way to shake down the producer nations to redistribute money globally.
David Suzuki, your thoughts?
Well, I don't even know where to begin on a response like this. You know, first of all, I've always defended universities as a place where basic research goes on, where we have tenure, and so we're freed from all kinds of corporate pressures or political pressures. And one of the terrible aspects of universities is that universities, because they've had financial problems, have welcomed corporate money coming into the university, and it's changed a lot of the scientific practices in the university. But I've always felt that it's universities where government money, that is money coming from the public, comes to support basic research, and we're freed from the kind of commitments to another agenda. When you have a scientist working for the tobacco industry, or when you have a scientist getting money from the fossil fuel industry, it seems to me that it makes a lot of sense that...
And next on the line is George. Hello, George.
Yeah, good morning, Fred, and a great guest. You know, I concur also that we need to put more emphasis in our educational system on science, primarily because that way our students and our young citizens as they grow up will not be subjected to scientifically motivated political propaganda. You know, just like, for instance, DDT. DDT's been suspended for a number of time, and malaria has made a huge comeback, so much so that the WHO, under the United Nations, talking about reintroducing the use of DDT. True or false?
Yeah.
True, that's exactly right. I'd like to ask your guest if he watched the Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth.
Sure.
Okay. You know, why is it in that movie that Al Gore's portrayal of global warming, and incidentally, just as a quick aside, 100 years ago in Albany, New York, they started keeping very intensive records of climatic temperatures, as you well know. The average then was 42.2 degrees, and today, 100 years later, in Albany, New York, same circumstances, 42.2. The bottom line here is in Al Gore's movie, not once did he mention solar activities and solar flares, solar cycles, as possibly the culprit behind a slight warming up that may or may not exist on the globe. I mean, how would your you know, we've got a local guy that's an internet skeptic around putting on some evaluations of the data, a lot of which was drawn from Al Gore's movie, that clearly shows that there's some bad science going on. You know, and just one last point, your guest says it's evil. It's just bad for corporations to finance private research, but no problem for universities to accept money confiscated by the government from these industries for government research that funds all kinds of activities, and they have, in fact, a vested interest in said research and those financial sources coming in. And finally, Kyoto Protocol, in my view, is just simply a way to shake down the producer nations to redistribute money globally.
David Suzuki, your thoughts?
Well, I don't even know where to begin on a response like this. You know, first of all, I've always defended universities as a place where basic research goes on, where we have tenure, and so we're freed from all kinds of corporate pressures or political pressures. And one of the terrible aspects of universities is that universities, because they've had financial problems, have welcomed corporate money coming into the university, and it's changed a lot of the scientific practices in the university. But I've always felt that it's universities where government money, that is money coming from the public, comes to support basic research, and we're freed from the kind of commitments to another agenda. When you have a scientist working for the tobacco industry, or when you have a scientist getting money from the fossil fuel industry, it seems to me that it makes a lot of sense that now their pronouncements are skewed. They're shaped by the source of the funding. That's why university support is so important. I'm amazed to hear someone say that the universities are the heart of another corporate agenda. I mean, all of these other statements, Al Gore's film being biased, well, I don't know where to begin. Because of Ronald Reagan's failure or disbelief in global warming as an issue, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was set up by the United Nations. Over 2,000 scientists, climatologists. They spent 5 years examining over 20,000 scientific papers before they came to the conclusion that global warming is happening. And then they took another few years to finally say, yes, humans are a part of that process. The human imprint is there. And every year since then, the scientific community has become louder and louder. You have the National Academy of Science, the Royal Society of London, the Royal Society of Canada. These are the institutions of the leading scientists of the countries have been saying global warming is real, humans are a part of it, we've got to act. So then when I have people like your listener calling and saying, Al Gore's film is biased, wait a minute now. Al Gore has just presented what the IPCC and the leading scientific institutions are saying. So you can pick and choose and find all kinds of things that may seem to support your position, but you've got to come up with really definitive evidence that this overwhelming majority of scientists and the scientific papers are saying.
One last
so
question
much
for
of the denial is based on a point of view, and people don't want their point of view shaken.
One last question for Dr. Suzuki. Is water vapor a greenhouse gas?
Yes.
It is.
Yes.
Why is it not included in all the models when they do the models graphing? All they show is carbon dioxide. Water vapor is 95% of the greenhouse gas released by the oceans, seas, and rivers. How can man be responsible for that?
No, man is not. Water vapor is a part of the model, as is methane and CFCs and the many other greenhouse gases as well.
Well, maybe you should get that word to Al Gore because he doesn't see it as part of the model.
Sorry, do you think climatologists are stupid, or do they have some kind of alternate agenda? You raise these points, but go to the IPCC website and look at it. This is, as far as I'm concerned, this is the most credible group because it's based on such a wide representation, and they've done a lot of studies. You raise these points of solar flares. Do you think climatologists haven't paid attention to that and dealt with that? Go to the website and find out.
All right, we must close here. George, thank you for your call. Sorry we couldn't get to everybody's calls, but David Suzuki, you've given us many action points here in terms of our own lives and in terms of inducing legislators to take our environment and environmental.
Boy, do you need a lot of science education in the United States.
Well,
and I think it's instructive, that in Canada we've had the nature of things, a science program since 1960 in prime time with a large audience. There has never been in the United States in that time a science program on primetime television on one of the major American networks.
On public television, certainly, but you're right, not on the
major.
but
those are different audiences.
Sure. David Suzuki, your new book, David Suzuki, The Autobiography. Thanks very much for joining us from the San Francisco Bay Area today. Thanks to Charlie